Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to this morning's meeting of the Economy Committee. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion on the economically insecure in London. Please can I ask you to switch off any electronic devices you may have so we can avoid any unneeded interruption. Can I ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if we'd have any apologies, please?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Polanski, for whom Assembly Member Russell is attending as a substitute,
Welcome.
and Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if any members have any other interests to declare? Can we confirm the minutes of the Economy meeting held on 13th of October 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings and any additional correspondence?
Noted.
We now move on to the main item of business for discussion this morning with our invited guests on the economically insecure in London, including financial exclusion and the gig economy. I'd like to first welcome our panel. We have Rajesh Agrawal, Deputy Mayor for Business. Good morning, Rajesh. Nice to see you. Sean Williams, Director of Policy and Innovation at Toynbee Hall. Great to see you as well. And Andy Chamberlain, Director of Policy at IPSI. Am I saying that right, IPSI?
That's right, yeah.
Good. And we have Max Dewhurst, a member of the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain. Max is joining us virtually. Great to see you. We will now open with the questions. As is our tradition here as Chair, I will take the first question. I pose this question to everybody except the Deputy Mayor. We'll get to you later. The first question is this. Maybe we'll start with maybe Max. We'll start with Max. How is the gig economy defined and which sectors does it include? What are the benefits and problems of the gig economy? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the gig economy in terms of work, pay and conditions? Now, I know there's a lot to unpack there, Max, so just pick out the bits for you that are most important.
Hi, thanks for having me today. Can I ask how long I have to answer the question?
Could we keep it to 1 or 2 minutes, because we will continually come back to you. We'll be going back and forth. There's a number of questions from myself and other members.
Okay, well, very quickly, the gig economy could be defined as the use of bogus self-employment, which is when companies misclassify workers intentionally to remove any sort of rights or entitlements they might have under UK law, employment law and otherwise. Often they're paid per task, per job, per delivery, per gig, so-called gig. And in some cases, they're controlled and managed via algorithms. And we see this hugely in the food delivery sector. I think perhaps delivery and private hire, mini cabs, food delivery are these sorts of things that we think of typically as the gig economy, but there are other sectors that also use the self-employed flexible work model a lot. We're increasingly seeing it with cleaners, people who typically don't have a lot of economic power that are having to sign their rights away and work job to job. We know it's increasingly in areas that you might think of as more public sector areas, such as cycling instruction, which is a public service. All of our members in that sector are self-employed, or 99% of them are. Benefits and cons really are both beneficial and cons for the employers and the workers. Obviously, people enjoy flexible work. They like to get money quickly. Often people are paid weekly or fortnightly. If they're in a lot of debt and they have debts to clear, then getting paid quickly is beneficial to them. But the cons are huge amounts of insecurity and irregularity, and obviously the cost of doing the job, which is when you provide the equipment to work, which we find is typically somewhere between 20 and 30% of the cost of the job. So I hope that is an introduction for you.
Thank you, Max, and it's a good start. You've raised a number of points there. Any of the panel members would like to come in? Maybe Toynbee Hall, if you just, what would be your starter for 10 here?
So from Toynbee Hall's perspective, I suppose our main concern is to make sure that the gig economy phrase isn't always used in a very positive sense. So when we think of the gig economy as really mobile workers with great skills who are choosing their work, then it's a really good place to be. But when you are forced into zero-hour contracts, part-time hours that change from week to week, that you have no control over, and you have a family to support, that's where real problems begin to surface. And that's what we see across East London in particularly BAME communities, particularly people who have maybe low English literacy levels or low educational qualifications, can't apply for a formal range of contract jobs and end up in the so-called gig economy. Alongside that, through the COVID pandemic, what we've absolutely seen is the importance of the access to digital. So if you are having to work in that way and you can't go out to go to a job centre to go and seek work, then being able to access work at home and from home has been really important. And yet we know that access to digital is really, really difficult amongst very many low-income households. So thinking about both the kinds of people who are in the gig economy, it's not just people who are choosing to be there, and also what they need to thrive in it. They don't have that. And so those are the two key concerns that we have.
It's interesting you say that, because I don't always associate the term with positivity, so that's interesting that some people do. If I could just come to Andy.
Hi, thank you very much. So we've heard mainly about some of the negative aspects, which I agree with, that there are definitely some concerns that have been raised very well so far. There are some positives. So you could define the gig economy as matching someone who has a service to offer with someone who wants that service to be provided via a digital platform. I think the digital platform is probably important here because that type of working has been happening for a very long time. It's just we didn't have the digital platform in the middle of it. That's really made this all much more accessible to everyone. So it's a much bigger economy now than it perhaps once was. The positives to it are that if you want access to a work opportunity, they are fairly easy to access. There's also a lot of people for whom the gig economy, who they work in the gig economy, but it's not their main source of income. They do it as a side, what's called a side hustle. So they might be employed from 9 to 5 their day job, but earning a bit on the side doing, I don't know, something like some graphic design or whatever. So there are positive stories within the gig economy, I believe, that I think most people would feel relatively comfortable with. There's also the negative story. So we've heard about bogus self-employment. This is a really tricky area. The employment laws in this country are very difficult to get your head around. So I'm not sure that it's quite as straightforward as to say everyone in the gig economy is in bogus self-employment. In fact, some people in the gig economy aren't self-employed anymore because Uber, of course, recently lost its case at the Supreme Court, and now they are workers. But they're still in the gig economy, but they have worker rights now. And the courts seem to be pushing things in that direction, which for some will be a positive thing, but for others might not be, because it may reduce that flexibility. Once you introduce giving people more rights, guaranteed hours, you're then going to ask them potentially on the other side of that you have to be there to do those hours. What some people love about the gig economy is that they can decide whether or not they're going to go out to work now, right now, or not. This evening, I might do a few hours, I might not. So some people love that flexibility. Other people, for other people, it puts them into a very risky situation. So I think there's a bit more of a balance thing going on here. But I do agree that some of the concerns that have been raised are real concerns for some people working in the gig economy.
Thank you. Just to come back to you, Max, could you give me an example of this bogus self-employed happening in the world? What does it look like? Where are employers and how are employers exploiting this loophole?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm going to use the example of Uber. I'm sorry I've missed your name who was just speaking, but I think that's a opportune moment just to clarify some of what he's talking about. At the IWGB, we are not concerned about the high flying execs and consultants who enjoy the top level style of the gig economy, having clients and customers of their own. But companies like Uber, who recently lost in the Supreme Court, use their economic power when they're recruiting drivers to make them sign contracts that say, Uber is your client. You know, that is a perfect example of bogus self-employment. Just to clarify as well that the Supreme Court ruling didn't say that the drivers weren't self-employed. It's correct to say that they're workers, but they remain self-employed for tax purposes. So it's not to say that they are somehow now on PAYE, or to say that they are any less flexible than they were working before. Their flexibility is completely maintained. Uber spent, 6 years saying that giving workers rights would take away their flexibility, and that has not happened at all. They remain completely able to turn their app on and off whenever they want, working for as many platforms as they want. So it's not true really to say that by giving people rights, they take away their flexibility. Even employees can work flexibly. It's dependent on the employer whether they want to allow that and whether it's commercially operational. I think it's just important to remember that it's not a choice that we have to make. But when there is an employer that is economically much more powerful than the individual, whether that is because they're not actually providing an alternative, for example, at courier companies or private hire companies, when you go and get a job, you aren't offered an employee contract, a worker contract, and a self-employed independent contractor contract. You are only provided the IC independent contractor contract. You don't have much time to read it, and you just have to sign it. So, that's an example of how in practice these companies get away with it. And like I said, we're seeing it increasingly in other sectors. And, if you're someone who's, for example, might have difficulties with paperwork or speaks English as a second language, or even me who's, fluent, you end up on a contract and then the company says, well, you signed it, you should be happy with it. But there isn't much choice left in the market. We're seeing the gig economy expand, and it is affecting more and more people who will end up signing their rights away so that they can earn £7 an hour delivering burgers. Like I said, we don't have an issue with people earning lots of money in the gig economy. What we have an issue with is low pay, insecure work. And I think the GLA has a very, very important role to play in humanising that in London.
Okay, thank you, Max. I agree with your last point. But some of the things you've said seem to be a problem just for employment in general, contracts you sign, time to read them, etc., if you have good or bad English. Let me just put this to you generally, is that through the course of this meeting, we'll be looking for a definition around this gig economy. Some of Max's comments have made it, you could almost put everybody in that category, or do we want to narrow it down? I think that's one of the big outcomes we could get from this meeting. Let me just move on to my next question. What has been the impact of the pandemic on the gig economy, both in terms of business and workers? Have we seen it? We've talked about an expansion. Has that been a good or a bad thing? What impact has it had? Because it seems like the gig economy grew because everybody was sat at home having people deliver stuff to them. Let me start with Sean.
Thinking about your question around the definition.
Yeah.
So across the community that we're working in, East London, we actually saw people's ability to earn income through self-employment fall initially through COVID, particularly, for example, where someone was an Uber driver and then no one was taking an Uber, their income suddenly fell quickly, and often from whatever they were earning to zero. The really difficult kind of situation there is that person doesn't have any rights to access to benefits for quite some time. They have to then try and find a way through that process. So the impact on workers of a sudden drop in income if you're working primarily in the gig economy or that's where your primary source of income comes from is significant. And obviously if you don't have savings, if you don't have access to affordable credit, if you haven't got family that you can rely on, then that dramatic loss in income is significant and has a long-term impact on your financial resilience. And I think we haven't yet begun to see what that really looks like for Londoners. And it's one of the things I'd kind of want you to be thinking about in terms of when people are in the gig economy, when they are dependent on flexible income in this way, then also thinking about how we can put in place long-term financial resilience programs for them. What does that look like? So that's the first thing to say about the kind of impact of COVID on people working in the gig economy. The second thing is I think it's forced a lot more people into the kind of types of gig economy work that maybe they weren't in before. So for example, if you were in a job in a shop and that shut, then you had to suddenly kind of try and find a new source of income, particularly if you were stuck in an income gap because you didn't have access to benefits. And so we saw people kind of scrambling around trying to become, for example, delivery drivers. And then they also had costs because they didn't necessarily have the right kind of equipment or the insurance or the license to be able to do that. So we saw people trying to kind of invest in skills, in bikes, in mopeds, sometimes in cars, and of course all of that increases their costs. So in that very, very low income range that I'm looking at, we saw quite a shock in income, and then for some people needing to invest, normally borrowing from family or friends or using savings to try and get back out there and get working. And then over time, for some of those people, I think we've heard that there are benefits there, particularly if you are working and in a job that you can flex around, for example, childcare, looking after, picking children up from school, those kinds of things. So we still want to be able to see that kind of flexibility for people, and people really valued that through the pandemic. But long term, we'll definitely see, I think, that shock, that income shock, is effectively taken away people's ability to be financially resilient in the future. And that's the thing that I'm particularly concerned about.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, the pandemic had a huge impact on the whole self-employed sector. And I do think we should try to be careful when we don't conflate the gig economy with all of self-employment. Most people working in the gig economy are self-employed, rightly or wrongly. Some people say they shouldn't be, but that's the prototype. But there are other self-employed people who aren't in the gig economy. All self-employed people, apart from in a few sectors, were impacted very badly by the pandemic. We saw demand fall off a cliff. Income went down to zero very often. And the government stepped up with some support packages, which were generous for some, but for others, they didn't qualify for them. The Self-Employment Income Support Scheme had a few nuanced criteria that you had to meet, which really no one was in control of. It wasn't that someone was more deserving than another person simply because they hadn't filed a tax return for the correct year previously to when the pandemic hit. So if people who were new to self-employment, or if they earned less than 50% of their total income from self-employment, and this is where those side hustle people came into it, or if they were working as a director of a limited company, which some people do in self-employment, they weren't able to access that scheme. So they were really badly hit. And we saw, before the pandemic, total numbers of self-employment in the UK was about 5.1 million. It went down to about 4.3. It is beginning to sort of climb back up a little bit. It's about 4.4 now. But that was a big shock to lose that many self-employed people in the space of about 12 months. So yeah, the pandemic had a big impact overall on self-employment, including many who work in the gig economy.
Thank you. As part of our definition conversation that we'll come to, someone's going to have to draw a line between the self-employed and the gig economy. Where does the term freelancer come into this? When I was younger, I temped. Was I in the gig economy? I think that's have to be part of the conversation. But my members will come to that. I'll give you Assembly Member Bakari at this point.
Caroline. It's me, Chair.
Oh,
Yeah.
I have
me then.
That's okay, Caroline, then me. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
That's okay. I just wanted to pick up on the impact of the pandemic and to raise one particular impact that I've been made aware of, which is the cycle trainers who train school children in all the boroughs across London are they're effectively gig economy workers. They get contracts from local authorities who get their money from Transport for London, hence it comes into the remit of this meeting. And so the impact on Transport for London's budget has decimated the loss of fares income has decimated the Transport for London budget. And I gather that the cycle trainers, there's a real risk that they will all go off and find other jobs to do because they're in a precarious situation where they can't earn because the councils have no money to employ cycle trainers to train all the children in cycling safely on our roads, which is a big part of the Mayor of London's project of trying to get more people making their everyday journeys by walking and cycling. So I just wondered, Max, if you could sort of say anything at all about what you see as the issues there, and whether there's anything that you think could be done to resolve this situation.
Thanks a lot. I think it's a pretty devastating blow for training in London, because the building cycle lanes if no one's going to actually use them, and if we are actually going to tackle climate change, we need to create a modal shift between cars and fossil fuel transport actually onto bikes. So there's a wider impact as well on achieving lower emissions for London to actually invest in cycle training, and that means investing in the workforce, who you're correct to say are part of the gig economy, or the so-called gig economy. They're engaged by third parties through self-employed contracts, that ultimately the boroughs are the clients. And we had a very productive meeting with Haringey last week. Haringey Council have actually agreed to underwrite the Q4 funding with a budget of £30,000, which actually isn't all that much money in terms of budgeting, and that's in addition to any funds committed by TfL, and it's going to be made available immediately for the remainder of Q3, although the actual activity is expected to be quite low.
But can I just come in there? So that's one borough who is committing some money, but this is a shortfall across the whole of London because that TfL funding is not available because of the problems with the TfL budget. So are you aware of anything happening with TfL to try and plug this gap to help these precariously employed workers? So what we want is that the boroughs to copy Haringey's example, and also for TfL to address the funding crisis and develop long-term funding solutions, so that there's actual investment in the workforce, because the workforce through the self-employed model have experienced a 12-year pay freeze. They have short notice cancellations and other work which is actually unpaid. So it would be really good if TfL could actually address those issues and engage with the union more broadly to find solutions that benefit TfL, that benefit the workers and London in general, because tiny bits of money here and there isn't gonna create a really sustainable solution. I just wonder, Rajesh, since you're here in the chamber, I wonder if you could have a word with Will Norman and Heidi Alexander just about because this is a very particular group of workers in London whose income has suddenly just dried up and disappeared. And that they're very skilled people. This is one group of people who are capable of teaching children in our schools how to ride bikes safely, and we are at risk of losing them. So if you were able to have a word, that would be very appreciated.
I'll be very happy to pick this up with my colleagues Will Norman and also with Heidi Alexander.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Before we go to Assemblyman Bakari, we as a committee, we will write to the Mayor. I'd like to ask a question, Deputy Mayor. If cycling is so important to the Mayor, why wasn't this picked up? Because we have spent money, for instance, on colourful road crossings that could have been directed to this, which would have two birds, one stone. It would have saved these workers in a precarious situation and it would have supported the goal to get more people onto their bikes. Why wasn't something like that done?
Well, there are two very separate things. So first of all, we're very passionate about increasing cycling, encouraging people to use more public transport, walking more and so on. And that's why low traffic neighborhoods, for example, were introduced so that people feel safe as they are cycling. In terms of, you mentioned about the colourful crossing, etc. I mean, that's part of the Let's Do London campaign to encourage more visitors to come into central London to help the economy revive. So these are two quite sort of distinct things, but very happy to pick up on this matter with my colleagues Will Norman and Heidi Alexander.
We will do the same. You're correct, they're two distinct things, but they come from one pot of money. Our money's for London, and it sounds like this would have been a better spend. Assemblymember Bakari.
Are you okay if I go to question 3 straight after?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Taylor Review into Modern Working Practices, which made a number of recommendations in relation to the gig economy. And one of the things it said that the gig economy workers should be classified as dependent contractors. Now, this is kind of going back into the definition of the gig economy. So firstly, before I go deeper into that question about the Taylor Review, Max and Sian, you talked about the negative aspects. Do you think it's now time that the government and there was a kind of a legal definition that was widened to prevent all the issues that we're picking up on some of the negative aspects of insecurity for these particular workers? Shall we just make I'd like a really clear answer from both of you, as we've been touching on it, but I want to get a clear answer from yourself and from Max. Is it time now to make a clear, widened definition?
Looking at the screen to see if Max wants to go first.
Thank you. In all honesty, I don't think it's going to actually make all that much difference. So I think changing names isn't the solution. The solution is enforcing the law that we have already, and our definition of employee, worker, and independent contractor, which is the true definition that we normally call self-employed, are the three categories that already exist. And changing worker to dependent contractor, it's window dressing. It doesn't really address the core problems, which is that companies roll out these models because they're free to do so, because there isn't enough enforcement of the existing law. But if the government they did commit to bring in Taylor's recommendations, we're still waiting on them to do it. A few of the recommendations are okay, but it's not enough to actually address the problem. And I think there is a lot more that can actually be done on the ground by the likes of TfL and the GLA in procurement and in the supply chain that actually will have a much more operational and big impact on people's lives, actually more so than changing definitions. But I like the spirit of the question.
Thank you. Sian?
For me, it's about outcomes and recognising that outcomes are created by kind of multiple drivers. So one of the things that I would recommend is that whilst the definition matters, it's more what's the purpose of a definition. And when you, Chair, said about what's the definition of the gig economy, I wrote down, why does it matter and what are we trying to achieve? And so really understanding what it is we're, one, trying to understand, and two, trying to do about it. So if our current definition leaves wriggle room for people to be exploited, something's wrong. What the right term would be, I'm not technical enough in the law around this to be able to kind of recommend. But what I would definitely say is that there are two drivers here. There's the relationship between the worker and the provider of the work, and we have many laws that protect those rights. If those rights are not able to be protected by the law in that particular relationship, something's wrong, and we need to look at that. The second thing is that the provider of work is not solely responsible for people's well-being. That's the role of the state. And the state is also kind of important in this relationship. So one of the things I think we need to make sure that we can do is that whatever the legal definition is of the relationship between the worker and the provider of work, the state also recognises that it's allowing that particular relationship to come into being, and that it needs to think about what its responsibilities are when that relationship breaks down, or when the provider of work can't provide enough work to meet the worker's needs or in the way that the worker is able to work. So thinking about all of that, I would definitely say that the gig economy is a phrase which is unhelpful to us. And the reason I think that it's unhelpful to us is because, as we've already talked about in this meeting so far, the problems that the negative impact or the negative conditions around gig economy are not limited to gig economy. It's not about having a digital platform through which you work that creates the problems. It's the relationship between the worker and the provider of work, the security around that, and the balance of power or the imbalance of power. And we've protected workers' rights in this country for really good reasons, for all the reasons that Max has outlined. So my answer, a short answer would be, the current framing is wrong because it's leading to poor outcomes. I don't want to give you the right kind of technical answer for it because I'm not that person. But being led by outcomes is what will help us get to the right solution.
What can the government do then to prevent situations? I mean, we've mentioned Uber already, and they're classing their workers, rather than how they class their workers, have managed to get them out of providing certain benefits and protections. I mean, how can they prevent companies like Uber wriggling out of those kind of areas? You know, what can the government do? I mean, I'm happy for Sian, yourself, Andy, yeah.
If I may, thanks. So you mentioned the Taylor review, and one of the recommendations in that is to look at employment status, and that's this thorny issue of what does the law say about when someone is genuinely self-employed or when they should actually be employed, or this worker category. And it is a bit complicated. It's all in case law. And Matthew Taylor recommended that the government should look at this and pretty much redefine how we think about that. And the government has committed, as Max said, to pick them up on that recommendation, but we haven't heard anything about it since then. That was 2017, 2018, that report came out, so I don't have the year in front of me. So this is an issue that we believe does urgently need to be looked at. At the moment, what the government is doing is saying we're going to leave it up to the courts. And then the problem with that is that, you know, a couple of Uber drivers have to go through a 5 to 6 year process, and without the backing of a union, they would never have made it to the Supreme Court, because the amount of money that they're arguing about in terms of their rights pales in comparison to the legal costs of doing that. So that's an inadequate system. We believe it would be better to have something better defined, actually in statute, which tells us all when it is appropriate to engage someone or to be engaged on a self-employed basis, and when that is not appropriate. These things will be more complicated than I'm making them sound when you get into the detail of them. I'm not pretending that it's not going to be difficult, but I do think, as Sian has said, what we have right now is unsatisfactory. There are too many unsatisfactory outcomes going on. And actually on both sides of it, you've got situations where you've got people who shouldn't really be self-employed, having to put their hand up and saying that, and going through a prolonged court process in order to get that justification that they're right. And on the other side too, often because of tax, as Max mentioned earlier, you've got people who generally are self-employed, and the taxman saying, no, you're not, and you've got to go through a long process there on the courts. So I think we could do with having a new look at this now, because it's just becoming such a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, from what I was hearing about Uber drivers, that they are they're not actually employed until they have their first trip, for example, when they actually make their first journey. So it's like saying to someone who joins a supermarket, you're not actually employed until you actually sit on the till and serve a customer. And I just think it's bizarre that we're in this situation that, you know, we're treating workers in this way. And I think it does come a lot down to definition myself. You know, I think that is a big factor. Would you agree then that further regulation of the gig economy beyond the recommendations of the review is then needed? Is that an agreed approach from most of you here at the panel? I'm happy to go to Max, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. I just wanted to say that, you know, the lack of enforcement is the problem. Matthew Taylor was the Director of Labour Market Enforcement until, I think, October last year. We're still waiting on the government to appoint someone. I don't know why BASE is taking so long in doing so. When they didn't have a health secretary, they found one in 48 hours. So I just don't think it's a priority for the government. But I think it's a good opportunity to, you know, if we're waiting 3 years for government to implement a review, if we're waiting on government to implement enforcement, you know, sometimes I think it's better to lead by example. And if the GLA want to make a kind of local enforcement body for London, I think one that focuses, as I think Sian was saying, about outcomes and about power. That, you know, that may be a kind of funny phrase, but I think it's the best way of enforcing the law, or looking at the actual relationship between employer and putative worker, is about the balance of power. It's about, you know, can a Deliveroo driver, well, they can reject jobs, we know that, but they can't actually negotiate the price. I'm sure lots of the people at IPSI can negotiate the price of their work. They can have a genuine and meaningful bargain with their client, and the client is their client, not their would-be employer. You know, so where that is a murky territory, I think the GLA can definitely take matters into their own hands and try and enforce the law already as it is, because the example that you just made about Uber drivers is the perfect example. Uber lost at the Supreme Court. You know, they battled and battled and battled for years, and still they're not implementing the ruling. They are not giving people workers' rights for the waiting period. So, you know, and their business relies on people standing around waiting for jobs, because that's how they can make the cars arrive so quickly for the customers, right? It's completely integral to it. So if the GLA can say to all of these companies, you know, we want you to prove to us that you are paying people for the entire period of their working time, and that you're paying them holiday pay and pensions at a minimum, and ideally other things like sick pay, maternity leave, and other benefits that come with employee status, then that would be a really, really good move. And I think the Charter is the perfect way to start that, but there needs to be enforcement of the Charter, otherwise the whole project is meaningless, or could become, you know, it won't succeed as well as it could do if the GLA doesn't have a way of following up with people that sign on to the Charter.
Thank you, Max. I mean, we're going to be talking to the Deputy Mayor further about this.
It's the next question. Have you finished?
Unless if you're okay, if I can just ask Sian just to add to that.
Can you make it very short?
But I'm happy to move on. It's fine,
Okay.
yeah.
I give you Assembly Member Ahmed, excuse me, for
Thank you.
supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. My question is very specifically about the legislation. The Queen's speech in 2019 included a commitment to introduce an employment bill which would build an existing employment law with measures that protect those in low paid and the gig economy, particularly as we leave the EU. Almost 3 years later, and I'm sure you've all noticed we have left the EU, we're not seeing any action in this area. we've already touched on some of the terrible working conditions and insecurity many of our key workers in retail care and delivery face with no sick pay, and the pandemic has clearly exposed that. A survey recently found that a quarter don't even receive the national minimum wage. The question very simply is, should the government bring a second reading of this bill forward sooner rather than later? And I wonder, Andy, if you could start off.
Yeah, I can go quite short, actually. I believe that, yes, we were surprised that there hasn't been more movement on this. We would love to see an employment bill for the reasons I've stated earlier, that we think this whole area could do with a good look at and be sorted out. So, yes, the government should introduce an employment bill. We can then argue about what exactly should be in it. There's a few recommendations that we have. But the fact that they just seem to have not addressed this issue at all, we think is concerning.
Thank you. Sean?
Absolutely. Yes, sooner rather than later, not least for the reason of the opportunity cost of not doing so. The longer we leave it, the worse the financial situation is for all of those people, particularly, for example, when they're not paying into pensions. It's a problem the government is storing up for the future.
Thank you. And Max?
Yes, I agree with the other speakers.
Thank you very much. My next question. Are you confident that workers' rights are currently being upheld, or have we seen evidence that working conditions have worsened since the start of the pandemic? And I wonder, Sean, if you could start with that.
I think it's honestly a mixed bag. I think we've seen some employers in this space really rise to the challenge. And particularly when they've realised how important their workers are to be able to keep their business model going or to adapt. And we've seen some work around where, for example, in particular, food distribution networks, people have been treated really well. And then in other areas, we've seen people being laid off very quickly, not given any chance if they've had to take sick leave, despite the fact that we've been in a pandemic and people have been told to self-isolate. And also people being kind of almost, forced into staying at home when there wasn't work, and kind of being told that they've got to make sure that that sounds more like a health condition rather than a lack of work and a lack of employment. I think the people that we're most concerned about in this space are young people. So we've seen many, many young people's kind of employment opportunities being cut simply because the jobs aren't there. The number of young people that we've seen who've had to go into this kind of work because there's no long-term employment available, particularly over the first year of the pandemic. And those people very often have no idea about employment rights. They're going to fall into that category of not being able to understand a contract. They've never had one before, maybe. Maybe their family don't really understand the situation behind them, and also they've not known where to go for advice. So when we start to think about how employers have been behaving through the pandemic, I think we've seen different groups affected in different ways. The final point I think around that is that often employers didn't know what to do. It was very difficult for many employers to get good advice, particularly if they were small employers. And so whilst big employers I would definitely hold to account and say they should know what to do, I think for many smaller employers, they've also struggled to be able to understand how to implement good employment rights around this area. So I think that's another thing to look at, is how do we support small employers to do this well.
Thank you. And Max? Sorry, no, I haven't finished. If I could, Karen, yeah. So Max, and then Andy, if you could answer as well, please.
Yeah, I'm obviously going to focus on the worsening conditions, because honestly, we haven't actually seen that much improvement. Sorry, there's a bit of background noise here. We've seen actually horrifically loads of furlough fraud in the cleaning sector. Loads and loads and loads of our members had wages withheld by cleaning companies that had supposedly furloughed them. For the people that are working, we've seen an increase in hours, mostly in food delivery sector and grocery sector, because obviously the grocery to home, supermarket deliveries have boomed during the pandemic, and hours and workloads have massively increased. And as workforces fluctuate because of the pandemic itself. There's obviously the people that are working are, as in the NHS, are working huge, crazy hours with crazy workloads. The no sick pay issue, again, huge problem. The government moved a little bit on it because of coronavirus, but obviously not enough. And with inflation now, the 95 quid a week or something that those who are entitled to SSP get doesn't really cover anyone with very much, and people are incentivized to return to work. And most people do anyway. The most worrying thing, though, is what we've seen is pay cuts for a lot of our delivery drivers and private hire drivers. Uber, for example, have following the Supreme Court ruling, have increased their transaction fee that they say. So, the worker is taking home, I think, 5% less pay, but on balance, it's actually more. Food delivery drivers have also seen pay cuts, but those pay cuts aren't actually going to benefit them in terms of holiday and pension like the Uber drivers are. They are...
Max, sorry, if I could stop, because we are short of time. I just wanted to hear what Andy had to say about that. Thank you, though.
Thank you. I'll be quite quick. So lots of sectors were badly hit by the pandemic. Examples might be creatives, people working in the hospitality sector, so think of musicians or sound technicians, etc. Income's falling off a cliff. The question then becomes, were they genuinely self-employed when the pandemic hit? Because if they were bogusly self-employed, then they should have been employed, and they may have been able to have access to the furlough scheme. So that's one question. The second question is, if they are self-employed, whether they're genuine or not, could they access the self-employment income support scheme, which some could and some couldn't, basically depending on luck. So yes, I think that the time has come to consider how we support self-employed people more in the round. We recently called for self-employed people to be given statutory sick pay along with the community union, and then I do wonder whether that self-employment income support scheme perhaps provides some sort of blueprint for something that could kick in for individuals when they're unable to work for whatever reason. So yeah, I do think we need to think quite more creatively about how we support people, particularly those on lower incomes who are self-employed.
Thank you. Chair, I wonder, we've heard from our guests about the employment bill, and there's a very strong agreement that it does need to be brought forward. I wonder if we could write from our committee to ask government if they could look at that, please.
I'll take under advisement. We'll have a conversation about that. For sure, that's a great suggestion. Just before we move on, Deputy Mayor, you were nodding when our guest was saying that the government should bring forward this bill. But of course, we've been waiting for the mayor for the last 6 years to do anything in this space. We've had a lot of talk about the mayor's charter for the gig economy. Even now, we still don't know where that is. So how can you nod that the government should do something when you, because it comes under your remit, have had 6 years, because of course you came in the first term of the mayor, have not done your bit yet?
Well, there are two separate things. So first of all, Taylor review has been mentioned. Government accepted 51 of the review's 53 recommendations in December 2018, a good work plan, but is yet to enact that and bring forward its proposed employment bill. Now, you talk about what we are doing. The fact is the mayor doesn't have any statutory power around this. What the mayor has is the influence and the convening ability. So what we did in the first term of the mayor brought the good work standard, which addresses a lot of sort of employment related issues. We've got over 100 employers signed up to it, covering over 250,000 workers in London. And in the second term, we are working on the Good Work Charter, which is specifically for we can all sort of there are different words around sort of gig economy or platform economy or all that. So there's specific work going around that. We are bringing together local councils, various stakeholders, platform themselves. I think it's very important they're part of this conversation. as we progress in this to develop the charter, I'll very much welcome any input from the Assembly and Assembly members and the committee on this. And I think this conversation is very helpful in that. Hopefully by spring we'll launch a formal consultation process, and by end of summer we would have launched the charter. So it is a sort of big conversation, but let me make this clear. In Max mentioned around enforcement, etc. The mayor does not have the power.
Sorry, Deputy Mayor,
to do that.
I didn't ask you a question around enforcement, because we all know that the mayor doesn't have that power. What I asked you is what you're doing, the mayor's doing, and your department. So, for instance, the 250,000 workers that you mentioned there are irrelevant to this conversation because they're not in the gig economy. You have had 6 years to do something about this. Remember, I'm not asking you to respond to the government's responsibilities. I'm asking you to respond to your responsibilities. You've had 6.5 years and you haven't done it. You haven't done it to this point. So we are just wondering when that will happen. When will...
I've just elaborated what we are doing, and I'd just like to add a bit more. And one of the challenges that has been mentioned here is that the people working in gig economy effectively don't know what their rights are. They don't know how much they're like. Often they will confuse the turnover with the take-home salary, which is totally two different things. So we launched something called the gig economy challenge, where we collaborated with a number of innovators and entrepreneurs and asked them to come up with solutions on this. And there's some really good solutions that have come up. One of them is from Finmo, which helps the people working in this area of economy to understand how much they're actually really earning, as opposed to confusing it with the turnover and so on. But the important thing is to bring everybody together on this, and that's why we are launching the consultation very shortly.
I agree. The important. First and foremost, that sounds like a really great innovation there, particularly for people working in the area. And I also agree that an important part of this is to bring everybody together. The point is, it's taken 6.5 years for any action. That's the point I'm trying to make. But at this point, I give you Assembly Member Garrett.
Chair, I feel you've teed up my question very well by asking it, which was going to be, what is the Mayor doing to support the gig economy? And I feel like we've perhaps just explored that over the last couple of minutes. I think one of the follow-up questions I had, you mentioned, Rajesh, about so during the Mayor's first term, there was the work that the Mayor was doing around the Good Work Standard, but that didn't include the sort of either gig economy, casual economy, freelance work that we're talking about and struggling to define this morning. And I understand from I think an answer to a mayoral question that we're now looking at the end of 2022. I think that was the timeline you just set out just now for that to arrive. And I just wonder why it was that wasn't seen as something to do anything about, from 2016. I mean, the mayor was elected in 2016, but I believe you were appointed as the deputy mayor as well in 2016. Yes. So we're talking about all the way from 2016 until the end of 2022 to provide what is well, I'm going to ask in a moment what that will do, so perhaps you can incorporate that in your answer. But I'm just wondering why why it's taken 6 years from 2016 to the end of 2022 to come up with I'm not quite sure what this good work standard is, and why the mayor didn't see that as a priority in the first term.
Good work standard was a priority in the first term, and that's
am I right in saying that didn't include the gig economy and casual work and freelance and so on?
Yeah, so there are specific nuances around it. So on sort of good work standard is more sort of focused on the people sort of working directly as a sort of employee. So it's about sort of employer. But then there is also the nuance around the freelancers in creative and cultural industries, again, who have faced a hugely difficult time. So there is something which is very specifically for that. I mean, 50% of the jobs in London's culture and creative industries are found by freelancers. So again, there's a number of things that have been done around that, including specific funds to help reskill, because a lot of these people have lost their jobs during the pandemic. And now in the second term, as per the sort of mayor's manifesto commitment...
I'm interested in what you're doing in the second term, because we're now in the second term.
Which is what I mentioned in the previous answer.
Yeah, sorry, my question was
around the Good Work Charter.
Priority in the first term, because I think, this isn't a new thing. So, from 2016 to 2021,
But the industry is
has-
constantly evolving, and in the second term, this is part of the mayor's commitment, and he's put it at the heart of it, and that's why we are working on the Good Work Charter, which again we are bringing everybody together, and we are aiming for it to be launched by the end of summer next year. And I think just in this conversation, last one, we know that we can't even agree on definition. It's a very difficult topic. And that's why it's important that everybody comes together. It's not, you can't just sort of rush it. It has to be, there are a lot of stakeholders here, and we must protect the rights of people, and it's fair pay is quite important to all of this. I mean, ultimately, I know we're going to also talk about the financial exclusion later on in the conversation. These are all linked to each other, and fair pay is a very important part of that. And that's what Good Work Standard also incorporates, paying London living wage. Another thing that Good Work Standard includes is the ability to work flexibly, and that has proved really useful for the employers who had that during the pandemic, because they were already prepared for remote working and flexible working and so on. So a lot of the work that we have done in the first term has helped the number of people and number of employers as well.
It does sound a bit like there's no real answer to why the mayor didn't do it. He just didn't get round to it, maybe, or didn't see it as a priority.
I completely disagree with that. I think.
So what did the mayor do for the gig economy during his first term?
Well, I've just mentioned that it's sort of the challenge that we did in terms of bringing innovation together and trying to find solutions around this economy. And this, in the second term, this is the part of the manifesto commitment, and this is what we're working towards. Yep.
So I get that you're keener to talk about the second term because that's where he's doing something. So my question is then, this thing that might come out at the end of next year, the Good Work Standard relating to the gig economy, in tangible terms, in terms that might appear relevant to one of the many workers we've heard about this morning, what will that actually look like? What will it mean to them?
So again, I wouldn't try to sort of presume what it would look like. I mean, this is a consultation process. We want everybody to give their input in it, and then on the basis of which we'll form. I wouldn't go in with any sort of foregone conclusion that this is what it would bring. But it's a charter. It would be a voluntary charter. We don't have any legal powers for companies or platforms to adopt this charter, but it would be a voluntary charter which the mayor would encourage the platforms to adopt. I mean, the mayor is already engaging. In December, he met with the founder and CEO of Deliveroo, for example. Recently, he spoke directly to Uber as well. So there is an engagement, and that is very important that we engage. So I wouldn't presume let everybody can come together. But again, I want to emphasize this, and I know you don't want to talk about what the government must do, but I want to emphasize the fact that when 51 out of 53 recommendations by Matthew Taylor Review was accepted, why has that not been legislated? I think that would do far more for this sector as opposed to what we'll do. But we'll do our bit. We are continuing to do our bit, but it's very important, and I'll urge the Assembly to also welcome the idea by Assembly Member Ahmed on writing to the government on this.
Well, in fairness, I think it's for me to say what I am or I'm not willing to talk about. And I actually do think this is an issue, and I've done this kind of work myself. And I think the point that Andy made earlier about the ambiguity about who is self-employed and who isn't and who is... and I suppose the point I would make to draw a line under this quite fruitless discussion is that perhaps it would have helped if the mayor had done something in his first term to encourage the government to bring forward the legislation that we've already talked about. I think the other question that I wanted to ask about, so I noticed when you were appointed as deputy mayor in I'm sorry, there was a point that I wanted to pick up on actually. I just want to emphasize, while consulting or co-creating or whatever we want to talk about for this is good, I think listening to your answer, I get the sense that the mayor having been in post since 2016 and you having been in post since 2016, perhaps this is an opportunity for you to have a second go at this, but I didn't hear anything tangible that you or the mayor want to achieve with this other than a big listening exercise which might result in, a sort of an optional sign-up. I get that it would have to be an optional thing, But you didn't. I don't think you listed anything that you're pushing for to put in that. You just want to ask other people what they think.
Often politicians are accused of not listening to other people, so I think listening is a good start. So we want to start by listening to what people have to say, bring various stakeholders together, bring platforms together, and then come up with a charter that would be, and I mean, I'll emphasize this again because you've given me a chance to have another go, is that it's not in Mayor's gift. Mayor does not have the power to legislate this or enforce this. So what bringing everybody together we can do is we can come up with a charter which people agree on, and then platforms can then adopt. It will have to be completely voluntary in nature, and that is what we are trying to do.
I mean, it is within the Mayor's gift to have an opinion, though, isn't it? To have a plan other than just to listen. The other, I suppose, the final question I wanted to bring up when I look back as a new Assembly member, I wasn't certain when you'd been appointed, and I saw that it was in 2016. In the little press release about your appointment, it said that the Mayor said that he wanted to be the most business-friendly Mayor that London had ever had. And I wondered whether either you, or perhaps on his behalf, he sees a conflict between being extremely business-friendly and being worker-friendly in the ways that we've heard about this morning, that employers are using their economic power to effectively corral people into suboptimal working conditions. Let's put it like that.
I see no conflict in being pro-business and pro-worker. I think they go hand in hand. If you are truly pro-business, then you are also truly pro-worker, because it's not a zero-sum game. And I think it's very important that looking after the people who are working for you, whether it's in definitions of employee or dependent contractor or freelance or whatever, but people who are working, I mean, they need to be paid fairly. Their standards of work standards have to be quite high. And that is what improves productivity. Having more diverse workforce improves productivity. So that's good for business. So when you look after the workers, it's good business practice. And so it's not in conflict in any way.
I think that's the sort of thing that people say at conferences, but I think what we've heard from Max today is that, in reality, businesses don't see it that way. They see that there is an economic benefit to themselves in screwing down wages and conditions and so on. So that is what's actually happening. What's happening isn't what you've just said. So but you don't see it as a conflict.
I think it would be unfair to just take a broad brush and paint every business as being trying to exploit the workers. It's not true. There are businesses who are unfortunately trying to take advantage of some of the flexibility in the law, and that's why it's important for the government to enact and bring the employment bill, proposed employment bill, as soon as possible. I think that would be very important to do that. But I see no conflict in being pro-business and pro-worker, because I think they go hand in hand.
Will you be just one final question, Chair? Conscious I've had quite a bit of time. Just on that final point you made about the government bringing forward that bill, would you or the Mayor be making a submission to the government in terms of what you or he would like to see in relation to the gig economy in that bill?
Well, we are happy. I mean, again, the charter would be a very good example of that. But it would be a good start if they accept. They've already accepted 51 out of 53 recommendations from sort of Taylor review. I think we'd like to see that enacted first. But in the meantime, obviously, we are working towards developing the charter, and there will be input going from there.
Okay, it's just disappointing that the Mayor of London isn't putting a voice into that process, do you not think?
Which process?
Well, you said the government should bring the bill forward, and I've said, what is the Mayor asking the government to do?
The bill is already, the bill is already, it was 3 years ago that those recommendations were accepted, and those should be legislated. That's what I'm saying. What we are doing is bringing a charter together. By bringing everybody together, put a charter, and then we'll be inputting in there's no process, like you say you are listening, and it's great that we are listening, but not everybody, government is not listening on this.
Fair enough. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before I go to Assembly...
Chair, can I just interject? Because from that exchange, it may have appeared as if all businesses are being labelled as sort of leeching on workers. Not all businesses take that approach, and it's about putting an end to bad practices.
Thank you. Just a quick before we go to Assembly Member Russell, do you still need to come in?
Just very briefly.
No, but before, I just want to quickly ask a question. You said that it's a good idea that we write to the government about bringing forward the bill. Have you written to the government? Has the mayor written to the government on this?
I can come back to you. It's been sort of some time, but I mean, all I was saying is I was sort of agreeing with Assembly members.
I get it. It's an idea, and we'll sit and have a look at it. My point is, if you're the deputy mayor for this, you should know if you've written to the government or not. It is a tactic of deputy mayors to say they'll get back to us, and they don't. If it's that important, and my guests think it's important, you've stated that it's important, you should know if you've written to the government on this.
Well, the mayor has publicly talked about this numerous times in the past.
You know how this process works. If the mayor writes to the government, if you write to the government, even if we write to the government, they will reply. It puts it on their agenda. Speaking about it on the news is not quite the same thing. We all know that. Assembly Member Russell.
I love your confidence the government will reply. I'm still waiting for a response to a letter that the Health Committee sent to Sajid Javid back in July.
He is new. He is new in his defence. Go on.
Basically, my question's all been dealt with, but I just wanted to say... actually in defence of what the mayor's been up to, because the Good Work Standard was, although it's been very difficult to get a handle on how many companies have signed up to it, and I think that's a really interesting area of questioning, but actually it is about good work, it's about good employment, and by definition, a lot of gig work is not good work, so that's, the Good Work Standard was all about. And we've had Rajesh has spoken to this committee many times about trying to make sure that employers are signed up to paying the London living wage, to being decent employers, and that's a positive thing. And sort of by definition, you would hope that the gig worker companies would actually join in with the Good Work Standard. None of them have, but it's I just think
you're correct, Assembly Member. The Good Work Standard is a good thing, but it could also be a talking shop. In fact, the direct question would be to the Deputy Mayor: how many companies have signed up for the Good Work Standard? How many of the 250,000 employees you talked about are outside of the public sector?
Over 100 employers have signed up altogether so far. About 250,000 people, 250,000 employees are covered with that. Last time I was asked the same question, and I gave a very detailed in writing answer with the sectors and so on to the Assembly. I can do that again.
Please do. So I want an answer
sector-wise breakdown.
That talks about how many of those employees are outside of the public sector, because
that is the breakdown.
The challenge for the Good Work Standard this committee posed under a different chair was why you don't have a plan. There's a number of very important employee things that could be resolved by the Good Work Standard. This committee asked for a plan to get more companies to sign up, and the mayor said no. So it would be very interesting to us how many people have signed up to that, and the particular piece that are outside of the public sector. That's important.
Again, that breakdown, just on that chair, the breakdown was given. I'm happy to sort of give it again, and there is a plan, and we are working on that plan.
Please indulge me. I am a new chair. I would like to see that. I give you Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. And if I could emphasise the points, we've talked about writing letters. Whilst I hear what you're saying about the Mayor's influence in writing a letter, I don't think that stops us as the Economy Committee doing that, and I would urge you, I know you've said under advisement, but I would urge you to do that on our behalf. It just adds to the argument and to the evidence that government, if they need it, that we do need to bring this bill forward.
Assembly Member, you are completely correct, but the loudest noise that could be made from City Hall
Chair,
is
I've
definitely
heard that, and
the
I've
Mayor.
said that I agree with that. You know,
I'm just saying that
I can hear that. I'm
you.
just saying that what we do here adds to that, and I think that is something that we do need to do as a matter of urgency. Assembly Member Garrett did ask my question, so I'm going on to the final one that I've been listed, which is, again, to you, Deputy Mayor, what other actions could both government and the Mayor take to support London's gig economy workers.
Sorry, Chair, could I just clarify and
you
apologise?
asked about the charter and everything, so we touched on that. I don't need to go into that anymore.
I mean, on the notes that I have, the question 5, which you're suggesting I asked, was an opportunity for other guests to say what they think should be in it, and I didn't do that. So I think that remains to be done.
So
on the question
to save
5.
time, I'm not going to ask it again. Deputy Mayor.
1 second, that is definitely your prerogative to do, but he's also correct, he didn't answer the question. Away you go, Assembly
Thank you very much, Chair. What other actions could the Mayor and the Government take to support London's gig economy workers? So, Deputy Mayor, that's for you, but it is for all the panel as well. And if we could be brief, because I know the Chair is going to ask us to hurry up.
Thank you. Throughout the pandemic, the Mayor and I have repeatedly called the government to close eligibility gaps in the self-employed income support scheme, which was spoken about by the other panelists here as well, and ensure that gig economy workers have adequate sick pay protection if they need to self-isolate. SSP is already quite inadequate. It should be brought at least to the London living wage standards. And then the government has failed to legislate adequately to protect the rights of gig workers, and still again they haven't acted on the Matthew Taylor review. So the employment law needs to adapt to keep pace with the modern business practices. So I think that's one thing that the government can do, and the Mayor continues to expand his reach through sort of good work standards, and also working closely with the Living Wage Foundation to progress the Living Wage campaign. The Mayor wants London to be the Living Wage city region as well by the end of his term, and we are working extremely closely with the Living Wage Foundation. The number of living wage paying employers in London since the Mayor took over in 2016 has more than doubled.
Thank you very much. Andy?
I'm just going to, if you don't mind, I'd just like to say a couple of quick things. So first of all, our discussion here definitely has strayed away from what I think is the gig economy and into wider issues, very worthy issues, very glad to be talking about them, about employment status, employment, self-employment, bogus self-employment, etc., all of which I think needs to be looked at. The gig economy is part of that, but that it is not it in its entirety. I also wanted to say, picking up on some of the earlier discussion, that our view is it is perfectly acceptable for a business to engage some people or a person as on a self-employed basis, provided the terms are correct for that, and provided that the individual has chosen to be self-employed, they're not being forced into it in some way, and we would say they should be paid properly. Most IPSE members will tell you that they are able to earn more working for themselves than they would be able to do in comparable employment. And this is, I think, what's come out today, what we've heard is this interesting, not quite what I'd say, but there's a problem here in that those at the lower end of the pay scale, if they're self-employed, they're getting paid less. They're not even getting minimum wage. They're the ones we're really, really worried about. At the upper end of the pay scale, self-employment is wonderful. It's brilliant. People are choosing it. They can be flexible. They can earn even more money than they could do in employment. And I think that the challenge for policymakers is to address the one problem whilst also preserving the good thing that's also happening there in self-employment. It's very good for businesses to have access to a self-employed workforce. It can help with peaks and flows in demand. It can enable that business to be more innovative, and it's very good for our economy. So we must preserve that whilst also addressing the very real problems that we see in the lower pay aspects of self-employment, including in the gig economy, but not exclusively in the gig economy. And by the way, the gig economy can also include some of the good bits of self-employment too. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could just interject there for a moment. We've heard about the Charter. I wonder, so if you could answer what you think, Andy, should be in that Charter, and then the other panellists as well, if you could respond to that. So what do you think should be in the Charter that we've heard about?
I'm not quite sure how to word it, but what I suppose following on from that last point is, I think that what we really don't like to see is where a business cynically uses the self-employed model in order to reduce its costs. So they can say, actually, if we engage just a self-employed workforce, we probably won't even have to give them minimum wage. And you know what, we won't have to give them holiday pay either. And we won't have to pay the employer's NI in tax that we have to pay when we employ them. So I would like to see in a charter something which captures that, which says businesses that are signed up to the charter won't behave in that way. Now, quite how you word that, I don't know. But that's the problem, and because that practice does sometimes happen, it's creating big problems elsewhere in the genuine sense of self-employment as well.
Thank you very much. Sean.
Thank you. So in answer to the question, kind of trying to bring them together, the Charter and what can the government do and what can the Mayor do, I think one of the most important things that we're missing here is really thinking about how lived experience can drive change. And all of the work that we do at Toynbee Hall is working with people with lived experience of the problem to hear not only how they experience it, but also for them what good solutions look like and how those solutions would work in practice. So for a charter, for government action, for action by the Mayor, in all of that, I would want to see lived experience voices at both ends of the scale, because I think we do want to draw out both what is working well in the gig economy and then what is working badly in the kind of fake gig economy, let's call it that, and draw that out and really build that. Because if we listen to people's voices and we listen to people's understanding and we listen to people's experience, that will drive better solutions. So that's the first thing I want to say. So I don't think it should be a charter by experts. I think it should be a charter drawn up by people with lived experience and expertise of the type that you have in the room today and others. The second thing is that when we're talking about the good gig economy, I still think we want to make sure that people understand their rights and have support to enact those rights or to seek redress if those rights are being trampled on in some way. So access to advice around what it means to be a gig economy worker is really important. And I don't think we've got that quite right yet. So in a charter, I'd want to see support around that. And then I think also we're just missing the point that having the Good Work Standard, which Toynbee Hall is very proud to be a signatory to and to be signed up to, celebrates organisations that do well. But I think we also need to shame organisations that do badly, because public opinion matters if you're selling things. And if you're a company that's going to sell to the public, increasingly post-COVID, people care. And so I think there needs to be something which is, if you're not signed up to the Charter, then there should be a level of expectation that you will be subject to scrutiny. Why aren't you signing up to the Charter? And that's where I think enforcement comes in. So for me, it is about a good agreement based on lived experience and expertise, bringing together what works, focusing on outcomes, and then for those businesses that are not willing to commit to those kinds of good outcomes, scrutinise why, and then where enforcement is required, including through the courts, that's what we should do. The final thing I would say is we're missing also the fact that legislation like the Companies Act undershrines much of this. And when we look at what the Companies Act places on directors around responsibilities, I think there's some legislation there that we can also think about, making sure that boards are held to account and directors are held to account for the decisions that their firms take in terms of where they prioritise delivery and profits. So thinking about the entire set of legislative tools that we have to use, I think would be really helpful.
Thank you very much. And finally, Max.
Thank you. I agree completely with the other two panel members, and I want to use the example of the independent living wage as a good structure for how the Charter could work in practice. The independent living wage isn't, statutory. It's not in statute. It's decided independently, and companies voluntarily sign up to it. And then by signing up to it, they are legally bound by it. And that is the hook that the GLA can use as a similar model for their charter, and to get buy-in from companies and to get them to actually commit to the standards that are in the charter. And I would like very much to suggest 4 standards that could be enshrined in the charter. And they are essentially basic legal minimums, but not entirely, but I think the approach is the correct one. In an instance where there is no government enforcement or meaningful enforcement or enough enforcement, then a lot can be done through procurement, due diligence, and this sort of structure. And I think the 4 things that should be in the Charter are, at a minimum, living wage plus costs. And it's important to use the costs add-on, because so many self-employed people have to pay for costs, the running costs of vehicles and whatnot. Basic workers' rights, as per the LIMBY worker basic, which is right to minimum wage, protection from discrimination, holiday pay, and pension auto-enrolment. The other aspects are akin to an employee. You can add them to the charter if you want, but I think the basic bunch are those. And then ensuring the last two ones are that companies abide by the ACAS code, which is a series of principles that govern HR processes, particularly around things like grievances and disciplinaries. And by ensuring that companies are abiding by the ACAS code, it will mean that we will hopefully see an end to things like unfair terminations, sacking through an algorithm, these sorts of daily practices that we are finding very, very difficult to overturn, and can only overturn through shaming online. And that means the worker has to be a member of the union, but there are of course thousands of people that are not yet members. And then I want the fourth one to be about safety, and to ensure that companies that are operating in the gig economy or through insecure work are providing or have some sort of safety standards, and we can collaborate with you on what those are. Emergency phone lines for workers, ways to report unsafe working practices without fear of recrimination, those sorts of things. So living wage plus costs, basic workers' rights, the ACAS code, and safety are things that I think should definitely be in your charter.
Thank you very much. That's very informative. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Ahmed. Can I just say thank you to my guests, thank you to the Deputy Mayor, and I just want to say, Deputy Mayor, I know we've had an exchange this morning, but you're one of my favourite Deputy Mayors because you turn up. I know we're on different sides of the fence, as it were, but at least you take your job seriously and always putting it in, and that is much appreciated. Having said that, I now release you to the wild because we are about to change guests and move into the second part of our discussion. Also, Max, thank you very much. Your input has been invaluable. I also release you to the wild. If there's any other additional things you think we need to know, please don't hesitate to contact us. We will act on them. Thank you very much for your input. Really appreciate that. We now are moving to the second part of our discussion. Sorry? Yeah, we're going to have a short pause. I will not be banging the gavel and stopping. We're going to have a short pause while we bring in a new guest and release our current guest. Can I just say to Andy as well, you are an absolute mine of knowledge. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch in the future as we pursue this subject. Thank you very much. Sean is staying with us to give us more benefit of our expertise. We are now joined by Abby Wood. Let's give Abby some time to sit down. No pressure, Abby. We're not rushing. Members, we're going to continue now. We are now joined by Abby Wood, who's a Chief Executive of Age UK London. It's great to have you here, Abby. Of course, you're about to join the second part of the discussion where we talk about people who are financially excluded. I will give you an Assembly member shortly who will ask the first question. Who's that?
It's me.
Excuse me?
If you're looking for the name of the Assembly member, it's me.
Is it obvious? Is it that obvious? Okay. I give you Assembly member
Russell.
Okay. You're bullying me now. I give you Assembly member Russell to ask the first question.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I was really glad to be substituting today for Assembly Member Polanski, who's up at COP, because this topic is really dear to my heart, and Sian actually came and gave evidence to the Economy Committee just before we produced our report into the financial health of Londoners back in 2018. So it's really good that the Economy is looking at financial health and how Londoners are getting on. And at that point, we were thinking about the ability of people to manage day to day, whether they can meet their one-off expenses, whether people can manage with a sudden drop in income, and also whether people can avoid or reduce issues with problem debt. And so I'm, yes, very interested from both of you, and perhaps I'll go to Sharm first and give Abby a chance to get into the room, on what is the state of financial exclusion or financial health across London, and how has the pandemic impacted these Londoners who are, whose financial health is precarious? So, Sian.
Thank you. So I would say that financial exclusion and financial health are two different pictures, because it's very possible to be included financially and have really poor finances right now, which is probably, kind of stating the obvious after the pandemic. So we talked in the previous session about how there's kind of two different experiences, and I think it's true in this topic as well. So thinking about financial health specifically, we've definitely seen, as we have across the country, many families whose income hasn't changed, but outgoings have gone down because through the pandemic they've been required to stay at home, and many outgoings have reduced, have been able to either pay down debt or to build up savings. And for those people, obviously the impact of the pandemic in other ways will have been difficult, but in terms of their finances, it will have been extremely good. So we're going to put them to one side for the moment. It's the other people that we kind of probably want to think about in terms of both lack of financial resilience, so poor financial health, and also increased financial exclusion and what that means going forwards. The people who've been most affected are going to be those people who have lost their income, have had sudden expenditure shocks as well, and then have had probably very little savings or access to affordable credit or other family members to fall back on. And I kind of talked about that already a little bit in the previous session. So why have people had increased expenditure? Well, partly it's because when you're living on a very low income, then you're going to have been budgeting incredibly carefully. And through the pandemic, some of the tools that you've used to budget really carefully have been taken away from you. You can't go to multiple shops and buy many different items in different places because it's the cheapest in that particular shop. You can't also think about how you can, for example, have your children at school, they're having free school meals, and you don't have to worry about that, and then you just have to provide, maybe one meal a day because those children are probably also getting breakfast at school or breakfast club. Suddenly, through the pandemic, those families have got children, often more than one child, at home all day long. And as they've gone into winter, they've also had to heat their homes when they probably weren't doing that before because the children were at school. So we've definitely seen an increase in living costs for the lowest income households because of the pandemic and lockdown particularly. But we've also seen the increased need to access digital tools and the internet generally. And that has been a shock for many households on low incomes who haven't got a really good data package. They're not using data a lot. They've maybe only got one device in the household, and suddenly they need to increase their access to data because they need to be able to homeschool, they need to be able to communicate, they need to be able to book appointments, they need to be able to seek for and carry out work. So data costs have gone up significantly, but not just data costs, also the need for devices. And so we saw in many low-income households the need to spend on being digitally connected in a way suddenly at kind of great expense without being able to shop around and without being able to have access to affordable credit or even the safeguards of, for example, having a credit card to be able to shop online. So a kind of double whammy in terms of loss of income and then increased living costs. What that meant is that people have used their savings, or they've drawn on the affordable credit they have, or they've lent on family and friends. And in those communities where we've seen widespread financial kind of precariousness before, we know that most of that money has been used up. And so I keep coming back to, it's now that we see the reduction of universal credit payments by £20 a week, and the loss of furlough, and the loss of many of the excellent forbearance measures that were put in place through the pandemic. As those start to fade away, but people no longer have any savings, they've used up any affordable credit access they have and probably haven't been able to repay it. And the families haven't got intergenerational savings either. This is when we're going to start to see real problems building up. In terms of financial exclusion, we know that, if you think about when you look for your credit score and what that gives you access to, the better someone's credit score, the better their access to a range of products and services. If we know that people haven't got savings, they may be behind on debts, and we are seeing across London, through Debt Free London, the Debt Free London partnership that we run, serving 25,000 Londoners a year with debt advice, that we're seeing utility bills, local council bills, so council tax, and rent arrears increasing, and it's an upward trend, and we're going to see that getting worse and worse as forbearance measures are withdrawn. And we're also seeing the unemployment rate in those particular parts of the community not falling, possibly rising. So the worst for many of these families, I think, is still yet to come. That also means that they can't access new products and services. So if they've got a bank account, it's probably getting very close to a zero balance or in deficit if they've got a current account rather than a basic bank account. They almost certainly are losing access to affordable credit, and they certainly have withdrawn savings, and they won't have insurance. Or if they had insurance, they're probably going to give it up because it's a cost that they can't justify right now. So I think the pattern is worsening, not necessarily because of what financial services providers have been doing, but because of all of the external factors and how that comes together in really affecting very vulnerable financial situations that were going into the pandemic, being made worse by all of those criteria.
And I mean, yes, that's sort of, it's sort of the extra costs of being poor, of, when your washing machine breaks and the only thing you can do is buy it on a long-term payment scheme rather than just spending the money up front to get a better deal. All of that exacerbated by everything that you've just talked about. Abby, would you like to talk about the experience of older Londoners or older people sort of through the pandemic in terms of the state of financial exclusion across London and whether the pandemic has impacted financially excluded older people?
Of course, so taking financial health first, you're probably aware that London has the highest level of people of pensionable age living in poverty, and that was the situation before the pandemic. Based on the most recent numbers that we've seen, we have seen a slight increase in the poverty rate. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation were estimating the number of people of pensionable age in poverty at about 23% in 2020. And Trust for London are now putting it at 24 or 25% this year. On top of that, there's one group that we're particularly concerned about, which is over 50s who were in work, possibly in quite precarious work, in part-time work, and on low incomes. And we've seen both through the information that's being picked up by local age UKs who are providing vital support throughout the pandemic, concerns about increasing unemployment amongst those people. And then this also reflected in the most recent ONS statistics showing that the number of people over the age of 50 claiming out-of-work benefits has increased by over 100% between March 2020 and August 21. So really some quite severe concerns about that particular group of older Londoners. In terms of financial exclusion more generally, the concerns about the impact of a move towards a cashless society were something that certainly AGK had been raising before the pandemic. The pandemic really, really exacerbated and showed how severe this problem is. So in particular, we were seeing old people who were advised to shield and were staying at home. A lot of those were relying on friends, relatives and neighbours, for example, to do their shopping or to pay some of their bills in person for them. And that's very difficult if you have always relied on cash before in terms of how do you go out and get it, the level of trust and confidence you need in someone to give, even if you have a bank card and your PIN number, or if traditionally an awful lot of older people relied on taking out their pension in cash from the post office, and that was how they managed their money. I think it's worth underlining that these older people, they were able to manage their finances extremely well, but it was simply in a cash-based system that works for them and that they should be enabled to continue to do. So real problems for not being able to access cash. We did see some innovative solutions. So for example, the post office and I think some other banks introduced cash by post systems that worked extremely well and were helpful, but it's a serious problem. And then seeing the ongoing closure of bank branches, an awful lot of older people prefer to bank in person, that has become more and more problematic, that people have to travel an increasingly long way, and given that travel was not advised during the pandemic, 44% of people over the age of 50 in London have a disability or a long-term health condition that makes travel more difficult. And it is worth flagging up that the temporary suspension of older Londoners' travel concessions before 9 a.m. is now in its 16th month. So there's also the cost of
So can you repeat that for me, please? Can you speak up? The mic's not the best, is it?
I was leaning away from it. What was supposed to be the temporary suspension of travel concessions for older Londoners before 9 a.m. in the morning, so the use of the Freedom Pass and the 60-plus Freedom Pass, they were suspended when lockdown first came in because it was assumed people would be staying at home. That was a problem even then for people over the age of 50 in very low-paid work who relied on that discounted travel to get to work. But that temporary suspension has now been in place for 16 months, and we are extremely concerned about that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just pick up on, Sian was talking about the problem with many households in London kind of needing access to data and access to devices that allowed them to connect with the internet. And I'm just wondering, for older people, I certainly know as a counsellor, I've got a lot of constituents who have, very... they might have a mobile phone, but it might not be a smartphone, the kind of whether you've got any statistics around access to digital connectivity and older people.
Yes, so we know that the number I'd really flag up in this regard is particularly with over 75s. This is an area of concern. So 45% of Londoners over the age of 75 don't use the internet at all.
Which is really shocking when they're getting their invitations to COVID boosters and things.
Yes,
yeah.
Serious concern. About, I think, 41% do use it a little bit, and then some sort of use it very, very occasionally. From those numbers, we don't know which direction which it's moving, but previous research has shown once someone is online, they're not necessarily online and using the internet until the very end of their life. It's not that you can necessarily get someone online and then that problem is resolved forever. Great, they will do all of their banking online. There are people who stop using it over time as well, so that does need to be beared in mind. The most recent numbers that Age UK London published showed 58% of Londoners over the age of 65 did use the internet to manage their finances to some degree. However, we haven't got a very detailed breakdown of that, but our estimate would be that falls away quite strongly with the over 75s, tying in with only 45% of them using the internet at all. And then within that, amongst people who do use the internet, you need a really strong degree of confidence to do any sort of financial transactions online. Sorry, I should have said the 58% of old Londoners who use the internet to manage their finances. That's of those who use the internet at all, which is about 78%. So we do know there are some people who are confident using sort of Zoom, perhaps some social media apps, email, and that sort of thing, but it takes the highest level of confidence to manage your finances online.
Yeah. So we've been given an estimate that between 2 and 4% of Londoners are unbanked, so presumably completely reliant on cash. So what are the barriers to Londoners accessing a basic bank account and also other financial services and advice? Sian, do you want to start with that one?
Thank you.
The barriers to access to banking remain the same as they always really have been. So confidence that if I walk into a bank account, into a bank branch, I'll be treated with respect, that someone will help me, that I won't be turned away. And, that is true for, many people who are going into any place of authority, whether that's a local council, whether that's a housing office, whether that's a GP surgery, anywhere that they feel like they don't have the power balance. We know that that's true, and we see that regularly. And that's true as much for kind of long-term Londoners as potentially recent migrants. So it's about what your perception is of how you're going to be treated by people in authority. And particularly in communities where there's a narrative of banks don't like people like us. My mum wasn't given a bank account, or my mum was turned away, or another family member maybe was treated abruptly or rudely, and I don't want to go and experience that. So self-exclusion we absolutely know exists. The second piece is I'm desperate to get a bank account. I know I really want one. I need it because I want to get a job, and I've been told that I can't get a job until I have a bank account detail to give for my pay. And when I go to the bank, or when I ring up the bank, or when I go online, all of the requirements around identity are still too difficult for me to overcome, because what's being asked of me is that I have a passport or a driving licence, bills in my name for the address that I live at, and maybe I don't have any of those things. So we still know that there are many people, whether they're on low incomes or from traditionally low income backgrounds, or recent migrants, or even long-term migrants, who have none of those things that are acceptable to a bank because of due diligence around Know Your Customer legislation. There is a programme in place, an agreement across the main high street banks, that the basic bank account has lower ID requirements, but we see that that's still being rolled out in a really patchy way. We're not seeing enough training of frontline staff, either in branches or on helplines or on web chat, to be able to say to a customer, okay, don't worry if you haven't got a passport or a driving licence or 3 months of bills, tell me what you have got, and then I'll work through it with you. We're seeing some good experience and some pilot work around that. So for example, Lloyds Banking Group are running a really good piece of work where they've got a support programme for any third-party support agency that is working with someone who hasn't got that kind of ID to be able to send in electronic copies of other documents, because one of the big problems that we've got is around kind of shoe leather time of when you are on a low income, or when you're struggling to get work and you're trying to get a bank account and you haven't got all of these documents and you're being sent from one branch to another or one bank to another. It's all adding stress. So the idea that you can sit with someone, you can scan in some documents, you can send them to a bank worker who's trained to look at them and say, yeah, we could accept these, or actually I still need one more document. Could you talk to your client and see if they could get this, or if they could find some evidence around that? And we'll put it all together electronically before we ask the customer to come in and make that visit. And also when they get there, they're going to be treated with confidence and respect that they're going to be served because it's been pre-approved. So there's some really good work around that. HSBC are doing some similar work around people who are homeless. There's also some good work around released offenders, recent offenders, because of course, people who are homeless, people who've been at their, living at Her Majesty's pleasure, haven't got all of that kind of documentation. So really struggling, kind of, when people are struggling with ID, they need us to go the extra mile because they can't do it. It's really hard to get identification documents if you're not coming from, a fairly kind of stable traditional background. So that's a really big key. And the last point is around the appetite in the financial services providers around risk and the customer. So a basic bank account, for example, there's very little risk in terms of building up credit because there's no overdraft on a basic bank account. But of course there's a risk around money laundering or fraud or terrorist financing. So Know Your Customer and IML legislation. And banks get heavily penalised if they approve an account and it turns out that it's being used for fraudulent purposes or any other illegal purposes. And so what's the risk within the bank? What's the risk appetite within the bank? And are they looking at the customer and saying, we really want to help you and we're going to do the hard work to check out that you are safe and secure? often we see that the risk appetite is let's just turn them away. Let's not even tell them that we've got the product. Let's tell them that the bank down the road will serve them because we know that actually they will. So we need to hold some of the banks to account around what is their level of basic bank accounts compared to their market share of other accounts, and are they really doing their job? Because I don't think they are. On other issues, but having a bank account is, of course, a gateway product, getting access to other services. And so it's not just about the fact that it's really hard to get a tenancy, it's really hard to get a job, it's really hard to get access to benefits if you haven't got a functioning bank account. It also means that you can't access other financial products and services in a more affordable, inclusive way. So it is really important.
Thank you. And hopefully the committee will take up that point about the banks needing to have a kind of fair approach to helping people get access to a bank account. The sort of the low risk appetite certainly needs to be challenged. Abby, did you want to come in on that, sort of particularly from the perspective of older people? I mean, we heard about people using, basically just taking their pension in cash and then spending it and managing their money like that. Other particular issues around unbanked Londoners
in terms of
who are older?
Really, I'd agree with what Sian said, and just add in, this is worth bearing in mind what is necessary for sort of age-friendly banking essentials. And a lot of these are things that are extremely basic, but we do often not see them happening in practice. So an awful lot of older people having a preference for in-branch banking, so being able to access a branch that is actually open at reasonable times, fairly close to them, a good level of customer service, listening to people, call centres in which the calls are answered relatively quickly and by human beings rather than by an automated service. Thinking about age-friendly design in terms of the branch itself, the location of ATMs, so that they're in a safe place where people feel confident taking out money, and also ensuring that paper-based options are still available for people. So for those who rely on cash, people who like to use cheques and receive paper statements as well, those sort of basic age-friendly essentials.
Thank you. Cheryl.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask specifically on this particular group, women escaping domestic abuse, that they have particular issues when it comes to accessing cash, and it's been highlighted in many reports that this is an area of concern. What's happening right now to help these women, and what more could be done? I'd like to go to Sian first, but Abby, lovely to see you in person as well. Abby, I'd like to hear from you too about older women in specifically too. So can we start with Sian and then Abby, if you can add on. And I'm really having difficulty hearing you, Abby. I think it might be the end of this room, but if you can just slightly move.
You basically have to lean into the mic like this or shout.
Yeah, sorry, it might be because it's just not carrying towards this end. Thank you. Sian.
Enough.
Yeah.
But some good things that we can build on. So very often when someone is fleeing domestic violence, they may already have some access to either banking or income, but then there's almost certainly, usually, economic abuse, financial abuse kind of as well. So they might have an account in their name or a shared account, but they might not be able to, for example, use it because someone has taken the card and the PIN. And so the first thing that we really must be able to do is restore access and sole access to someone's account or their income. For example, if they're receiving benefits, very often a woman, for example, might be receiving child benefit but might not have access to the money because it's being accessed instead by an abusive partner through an account. So the first thing is always to identify, does the person have access to an account? And is there a way to restore that person's access to the account? Because that's the quickest thing to do. And to do that, bank staff need to be trained to be able to have a really sensitive conversation, because very often, unless a woman is or a victim of domestic violence is already in a refuge or receiving specialised support, they're very unlikely to talk about it. So it's challenging, and it's one of those scenarios where being kind of alert to the kinds of signs of domestic abuse that includes financial abuse is really important. And we'd really encourage banks and all financial services providers, amongst other providers of support services, to just continue building their knowledge, continue training frontline staff, people on telephone lines, to be alert to that this might be a problem. Once someone has actually either identified as a victim or they're being given specialist support, then it becomes a lot easier, but we still have to go through the process of making sure that they can access an account. Crucial, of course, is that if they've left the place of abuse, so if they've left a home, that they can access their account without the abuser finding them through the account. And so giving them confidential access and making sure that they can open an account using a care of address is really important. And again, it's a really mixed bag across the banks. Some banks are doing it really well, others not so well, and sharing good practice on this is really important. And I think that's where, for example, an organisation like UK Finance plays a really important role, because that's the place where banks can come together and share good information. What we'd like to see more of is organisations like UK Finance sharing good practice stories, and as I say, media really matters in these moments, and saying which banks haven't yet done it. But of course, an organisation like UK Finance is never going to publicly shame its members in any way whatsoever, and so then others need to step up and say, why isn't X bank doing this? It's really important. The other point is around making sure that in the moment between someone leaving an abusive situation and being able to access, for example, benefits, if they need that, if they haven't got an income, then we need to make sure they've got emergency support. And it's really difficult to kind of give them emergency support if they haven't got an account. And so being able to do things really quickly matters too. So safely and securely, ideally giving them access back to their own account, because that's the most empowering thing to do, is to kind of get a sense that you've got control back over something important, and making sure that any income coming that is their right to have, that they have access to. So having a really good relationship with DWP, particularly around this, is very important. Now, not all banks have really kind of understood this yet. There's a lot of good work kind of isolated, and what we'd like to see is kind of more good practice sharing in all of these areas, you know, not just victims of domestic violence, but in homelessness and other areas of particular vulnerability.
Thank you. And anything specific on older women particularly, do you think?
I don't have a huge amount to add and can't speak with massive authority on this. So I would mention the government only started recording domestic abuse amongst people over the age of 75 very recently, so it's hard to get information on this. Two things I'll mention. One is, if you were after any information or insights beyond the great stuff that Sian has shared with you, there's a charity called Surviving Economic Abuse who specialise in that, and they might be able to give some more detailed insights into this. And then this is an issue that is separate from abusive relationships, but I feel it is worth flagging up. Amongst older people, there is sometimes one member of the couple who does the banking and takes care of the finances, so it's worth flagging up the particular vulnerabilities if that person either dies or becomes increasingly disabled or incapacitated, the vulnerability that leaves for both members of the couples. We've come across couples where perhaps one was happy using the internet and the other didn't use it at all. One took full charge of the finances, not in an abusive way, but in the way that the other partner was left very, very vulnerable afterwards.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Harani?
Just a very quick follow-up, because I was quite alarmed with something that came out from Sean's contribution on ID and the 2 to 4%, because obviously this is about to get much bigger than banking, because soon, if the government has its way, it will include the right to vote as well, and needing ID to vote. So are you aware, or do you know of any plans to ramp up activity to get people appropriate ID, so that they are, well, at the moment we talk about unbanked, but actually there's potential to be excluded from society and decisions that impact people as well?
The only activity that we're aware of is amongst activist groups who are supporting inclusion. One of the conversations that I'm involved in at government level with DCMS is around digital ID and how important it is for digital ID to be designed in an inclusive way. And I have to say I'm encouraged by the conversations I'm having with the department around the idea that a digital ID done well could help solve this type of exclusion that we're already experiencing, where someone doesn't have a passport or a driving licence, for example. Because government holds a lot of data about people even when they don't have a passport or a driving licence. So benefits data, even someone who's been recently released from prison has got a government record that they really know who they are and almost certainly has their fingerprints. So government data is much broader than the kind of data that banks, for example, right now are able to accept. And if we can find a way to really kind of deliver on that promise of a truly inclusive digital ID, then I think we solve not just for banking, but for access for financial services generally, and then through into, for example, civil rights and the ability to vote. I think that's really important. I don't think that the majority of people who are excluded from banking are also the kind of people who will think about voting for very similar reasons about, I don't have a stake in this society. So I think it's a broader conversation about helping people understand that they're valued. And of course, to get to there, we have to hold a whole change of narrative.
And Abby, in terms of a digital ID for older people who may not have a smartphone, how would you see that working?
I think digital ID could be incredibly helpful, as Sian said, for an awful lot of people, but it's really not going to work for a great deal of older people. And I don't think, I think that can't be the only option that's available, given particularly amongst over 75s, the large proportion who don't use the internet, never have, didn't in their daily life, don't have a device that they could use, are looking at the financial barrier of gaining one. That doesn't mean that it's not a really, really good option that can tackle a lot of barriers for older people, but there needs to be an alternative for those who aren't online and realistically might not be online either in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Let me start with Sian. What actions can the Mayor and central government take and the banking industry to encourage greater take-up of basic bank accounts? For instance, I asked the Mayor a question, what is he doing around financial exclusion? And he told me through his advice campaign, he's setting local settings. They are encouraging people to get advice around financial debts and stuff. And where possible, they could also help people with bank accounts. And they say work with lots of different partners. Has your organisation had any experience of this work being carried out by City Hall? Have you come into contact with it? And is there other things that City Hall or the government could be doing to help this?
So because Toynbee Hall delivers both services locally in East London and also runs Debt-Free London across the whole of London, all London boroughs providing access to free debt advice. Plus, we are engaged in many of the ongoing kind of recovery discussions around how we get out of COVID well. We're both hearing and seeing a lot of the activity that City Hall is leading around thinking around financial inclusion, financial well-being, financial resilience, financial recovery. So yes, in terms of how much of that action post-COVID is already kind of turning into tangibles, as in the majority of work, we're still very much in early phases about thinking about what works. Being very specific on what would I like to see the Mayor do and what would I like to see government do. So starting with government, it's really hard to hold the banks to account when the government doesn't. And what I mean by that is the government receives an annual report from the banks on basic bank accounts, but it doesn't ask them to report on why they refused people access to a bank account. And actually that's really important data. If we know that people are being excluded because of, for example, their ethnic background, that's really important to know, but there's no way of knowing it. And we know that financial exclusion, particularly access to banking, is highest in BME communities. And if we want to tackle that kind of exclusion, we have to see the data and we have to see which banks where are getting that right and learn from them, and which banks where are getting that wrong and then try and rule that out and design that out. So greater data transparency in what the government asks the banks to report to them and really holding them to account, I think is really important. I don't think that's being done to the level of scrutiny that gives us useful data to work on. Secondly, when we see really good practice, I would like to see government at all levels, including City Hall, sharing that, really praising that and encouraging others. So for example, we can see that particular banks are doing great work around inclusion, and a banking summit around inclusion, a conference, bringing together different banks, sharing their experience, really, really promoting their kind of good practice and having practical toolkits to work together. The reason I would say that that's kind of really important is not so much the banks learning from each other, although we want that. They have an opportunity to do that through UK Finance, which is their trade body. But it's the outside world who doesn't hear about it. So we only hear that HSBC is doing great work around, for example, homelessness or former offenders because they put out big adverts. So it's a kind of branding exercise rather than an inclusion exercise. So the most important thing is that civil society, local authorities, third sector support, that they all have a dedicated point of contact with local banks so that when they come across someone who isn't banked and they'd like to help them get banked, it's a really easy journey. And that journey is really difficult. I'd like to see a financial inclusion strategy for London. I'd like to see a financial inclusion standard for London. And that would look, for example, around how you treat someone who doesn't have ID, driving licence, bank account, passport, and how all the branches in London will behave. If we had a charter like that for London, what it looks like to be well banked and well served by your bank, that shifts the power again, the power balance between the service provider and the hopeful service user. It also would mean that if I am someone who is nervous of authority or has been turned away before and has had a bad experience, and now I have a charter to draw on, and I can walk into a branch and I can say, hey, I've seen this charter that you're going to look after me. I really need a bank account, I'm struggling or I'm stuck. They'd have something to point to. At the moment, it's very much a case of whether the member of staff is having a good day, has the right training, and whether their branch manager values financial inclusion or not, as to whether that person will get served well or not. So having some kind of charter that we could collaborate and draw together, and obviously I'd love to be involved in doing something like that, that we could really hold banks to account, but not just banks. What about someone who has invested in insurance, and yet their insurance provider doesn't pay out? Their view then is that insurance is a waste of time, it's a rip-off. They'll never invest in insurance again, but not only that, they'll tell their fellow residents in the area, they'll tell their family members and friends, they'll tell anyone who asks them about insurance, don't bother, it's a waste, it's a rip-off. So a financial inclusion and a financial services charter for London, what can Londoners expect? We're the financial capital of the world, and yet Londoners do not feel well served by their financial services providers. That would be quite an exciting opportunity.
Thank you for that. And also, when you talk specifically about older people, I used to run a 60-plus day centre. It was then changed to 50-plus, which technically means I could be a member. But the point is this, there's a specific thing for older people, isn't there? Because it's about advocacy, it's about trust, it's about some older people will never gain those skills. So how do we reach out and provide that service? So is there things that the Mayor could do around a charter, around convening power, around just championing what particularly older Londoners need? Because of course we have a very large number, an ever-growing number of older Londoners.
So what I'd really like to see is, as part of the Robust Safety Net mission, there's the commitment to the Advice in Community Settings programme. I think £1.5 million has been invested in it to support and provide that kind of advice, that information for people on various things, including help in opening bank accounts. I'd really like that to actively consider the needs of older people if when that service is being advertised, that it's being targeted towards older people, that they are both made aware that it exists, that it is for them, and that they will be welcome within that. I think given that that is already happening, that seems like one of the most practical things that could happen to make sure that this service that's going to be taking place really serves older Londoners.
Okay. Is there something that banks in particular could do with this video calling, with this, we all on all number of apps now, and I know for older people, digital devices are a challenge, but many older people are members of Age UK, they're a member of their local, like when I used to run the Pepper Pot. Is there somehow that those organisations could be used to support older people through video calling, through whatever it is? Because I'm always aware, unless you're effectively a family member of that older person, they shouldn't really be giving you PIN numbers and cards anyway, and is there something that could be done in that arena? Because I'm just so desperate for those older people who are separated from everything that's going on because they have no one to sort of take them on that journey.
I think when it comes to banking online for older people, there's two sides to this coin. One, there is a need for more support for those who want to do it, to be able to do it well and safely. So local AGKs run brilliant skill sessions, building up people's skills and their confidence in order to be able to do that. But there are other barriers as well. There's the barriers in terms of getting advice. So we need to see device providers becoming more aid-friendly, looking at deals for older people. There's the cost of accessing the internet overall, which Sian mentioned earlier, which can be very high. There are some social tariffs that are a good thing and need to be part of the offer. There are some social tariffs that you're eligible for if you're in receipt of universal credit, but you're not eligible if you're in receipt of pension credit. So I imagine it wasn't intentional, but older people on low incomes are actively excluded from those. So that needs to be looked at as well as in terms of the barriers, so that people can feel confident doing that. The other side of the coin is that there are some people who will not ever want to do their banking online, and they should not be excluded. There needs to be the option for them to speak to a real person over the phone, or to go into a branch, perhaps with a family member or a friend, to provide support and do their banking in person or over the phone. Both options need to be available.
Okay, thank you. I'll give you Assembly Member.
What either the mayor or government could do to try to encourage, more take-up of those, and what impact that could have?
It feels like a very long-standing question. How can we support and encourage greater take-up of credit unions? And one that many, many good minds have worked hard on, and many millions of pounds, including in the Growth Fund, have been invested in, and we still haven't achieved it. So one of the first things is visibility. And for example, each year, Transport for London allows a firm, a business, to sponsor the free travel on Christmas Eve and around New Year, and gives that firm free advertising. What about if instead we advertise credit unions and responsible lenders? Not necessarily at Christmas, but at a point in the year, for example. Another point would be around, if we genuinely want to see people accessing a credit union, then they have to kind of have easy access to it. And if you look at most credit unions, they've really struggled through the pandemic because most people have been told not to go out. Most of them are still running in, a kind of, this is probably truer across the country than in London, but, in fairly small offices and not great IT systems. There was an attempt to create a unified back office system for credit unions, which hasn't been particularly successful. So although it's really tempting to say kind of greater centralisation, mergers and acquisitions, kind of thinking in that way to get scale and scope, my sense is it doesn't really work in the credit union sector as it currently exists. But one thing that government could do, and John Glenn as Economic Secretary to the Treasury and Financial Inclusion Minister, and Guy Opperman, also Financial Inclusion Minister, have been thinking about for some time, is whether we want changes to credit union legislation in order to be able to kind of create a twin track offer. So there are credit unions that are very small, very kind of community based, and they don't want to change, they don't want to grow. But there are other credit unions, London Mutual Credit Union, for example, who, if they could have a wider range of products, which would include charging some higher rates for some products to people for whom that would be appropriate, then that would enable them to grow their business and be able to reach more people. So I think looking at legislation again and making sure that credit unions that want to grow, that want to scale, that want to give a wider range of products and services are not hampered from doing that because of old legislation and also old perceptions around that a credit union shouldn't charge more than 3% per month. Affordability testing is the way to decide what someone should be charged, rather than a kind of a sense of 3% a month is a maximum. So I think we are hampering credit union growth. And the final thing is that almost the easiest way to get people involved in a credit union is through their employer. And so if we had a London-wide programme that every council, every NHS department, every hospital, every school, every kind of employer in the state across London automatically was offering auto-enrolment to their employees on joining the organisation into a credit union with a savings scheme. And then increasingly, credit unions across London are thinking around, for example, salary drawdown. So you kind of go to a financial institution because it serves a need. For most people, they're not going to look at a credit union because they've got some sense of kind of wanting to help their community. You know, when we're thinking about how can we help people with their financial health, we need to give them products and services that meet their need. And one of the most important things right now is to help people access already earned salary before the end of the month when it's appropriate to do so. The conversation around there is a really tricky one. Most employers are scared of that conversation because it feels like you're luring someone into some kind of financial predicament. But actually, what if you're helping them avoid having to go to a really high-cost lender instead? So I think we need to do more work around that.
It's quite interesting, actually. You sort of moved the conversation a bit onto employers, which, in fact, you have skillfully anticipated what I was going to ask, which was partly harking back to the conversation we had earlier about the Good Work Standard, because, in fact, in the Mayor's Good Work Standard, there is a statement about that, about, offering affordable financial services and sort of payroll loans, which is sort of what you're talking about there, either for rent and membership of a credit union. And I just wondered whether you'd sort of seen any impact of that. Or, I mean, I was going to ask whether you see that as a benefit. Obviously, you do, and I just wondered whether you'd seen any sort of footprint of that happening.
It's one of the. I think it's a really difficult thing to do, and I see across the whole country it's a really slow process. So Money and Pension Service ran a series of challenge groups, and I sat on the one around kind of good finance in the employer space and how can an employer be the route to financial health. And one of the things that came through really strongly talking to a wide range of employers is how nervous they are about making these kinds of decisions. So will the credit union go bust? And then all of their staff have signed up to it and their money's in there, and then what happens? Well, you know, there's legislation that protects people's money in credit unions, and it's about explaining those things. So I think that I'm not surprised, but what I also think is that there's not enough work done explaining to employers, for example, the benefits of a credit union, that a credit union deposits are protected in the same way that they are in a bank, and also how we kind of get over that kind of challenge around the idea that if you're referring, in this case, your employee to a particular financial service provider, is that legal? You know, how do you kind of frame that and educate finance directors, for example, what they're allowed to do? Now, we had a similar challenge when we were looking at social landlords, social housing tenants, and the fact that many social landlords across the country were struggling with this same problem of worrying that they were about to break the law if they created a partnership and referred people to a local credit union. We worked really effectively with the FCA to issue a kind of explanatory statement that went out to all social landlords to explain what they could and couldn't do, and that was really helpful. So I think one thing there is that we probably need more support from the regulator, because it's the regulator that everyone's scared of. So if we can get the regulator to really explain to employers what they can and can't do about that. The regulator's been a bit busy with quite a lot going on through COVID, but it's definitely something that I think would be worth exploring.
Okay, I mean, it sounds like as well something that the Mayor could sort of put his trumpet to a bit, because it sounds like what you're talking about is that a lot of the key legislative bits are in place and it just needs people to know a bit more about it. So
absolutely.
The other question I had, which you may want to comment on as well, Abby, but if you want to go first, Sean, was about Sean, not Sean, I apologise, Sean, and Sean. But it was about improving financial literacy, about what work's being done and what could be done to improve financial literacy, because obviously that's the other end of it, is that however difficult somebody's predicament, if they're poor at managing it, it obviously makes a bad situation worse, doesn't it?
Yes, so we've still got a very patchwork approach, and it's mostly driven by financial services institutions creating grant funding, often channeled through a foundation. So Santander Foundation has recently, for example, advertised their new funding round. And what that means is that you're looking at applications to a funding stream, people deciding without kind of full knowledge of the whole context, and by that I mean the kind of geographical spread, about where to fund. So really important piece of work that's going on at the moment, again being led by Money and Pension Service, is working together with UK Finance and the main banks and financial institutions working in this space to both map distribution across the country around access to financial literacy, and then also kind of have an approach, an attempt to reach agreement on how to plug gaps rather than duplicate effort. A lot of this is tied up with employee volunteering in financial services firms, and of course you'll volunteer where you've got a branch, and then we're seeing branches being closed. So there's a knock-on impact around not having a branch in a particular area about whether you're going to be interested in funding anything in that place, because if it's part of your employee volunteering programme, it's going to be much more difficult to do. But of course with increased access to being able to deliver that kind of skills training through digital means, you know, there are ways to overcome that, but it is a factor to think about. So the other thing to think about is that we've got financial literacy on the school curriculum, but not for all schools. Academies don't have to comply. We've got it on too late. It needs to be on, you know, from the beginning of school, and there needs to be skills training and support into schools to be able to bring that into every classroom. We don't have that yet. Martin Lewis from Money Saving Expert, you know, invested his own money into creating a textbook. What we need to do is to get that into every school in London so that every single teacher has resources. And I think the final thing is around creating a community of support, and that's really important. We often see in financial literacy, and we run financial literacy programs across London. We run something called Community Money Mentors, which is 60 hours of supported learning. Gives someone an OCN entry level 3 qualification, so it's deliberately aimed at people who don't have much educational experience, and it transforms people's lives. And what they then do is go out and work with their community as a money mentor, so supporting their peers, because it's financial literacy really isn't best done as kind of one-off shots in the dark with no follow-up. What you want to do is really kind of create a community of support. And one of the things that we're thinking about all the time, and it comes out in all of our research, and I commend to you the report that we've done recently with Londoners across the income range who've had problems with debt and their experience of accessing advice services. It's called We're Not on a Conveyor Belt. What's come out again and again and again is the stigma of shame. If you're struggling financially, whether or not that's debt or whether you just don't know what to do, it's embarrassing. People don't want to talk about it. And we really have to shift the dial on that.
That's really useful, thanks. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything, Abby, sort of specifically relating to, you know, financial education of older people, whether that's a different problem.
I think just to flag up that there are a whole range of different kind of services and courses that are available. Quite often we see that they are either actively targeted at younger people, or they're framed more in terms of it feeding into life skills you develop when you're young, or even feeding into a career. And on the one hand, it's very useful that people for whom that is relevant is made clear. That can make older people simply feel that it's not for them and that they wouldn't be welcome, even if it's something that could meet their needs very well. So it's actually a question really in terms of the presentation of it, but that can have an impact in terms of older people feeling unintentionally excluded.
Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Very quickly, I'm really pleased that you mentioned the fact that schools don't actually necessarily have to teach financial education, which is in the national curriculum since 2014, but with a rising number of academies, we're going to see a loss of this. So my question is this: how do we make sure that we do get better improvement in financial education in schools, and do you think primary schools should be doing more?
So your second question, yes. But of course, we've got to equip them. It's just unfair to say to a primary school, you have to do this, but not give them the additional resources. So we have to make sure that they've got age-appropriate content, that teachers or teaching assistants or specialists are provided with the skills and the resources and the time to be able to do this. I think, you know, we see too many teachers say, I'd love to, I know it's important, but I just haven't got time, or I haven't got the confidence, or my own money's a mess, you know. I'm ashamed, you know, to kind of go into a classroom and talk about it. I haven't got it right myself. So really kind of understanding the barriers to why it doesn't happen. is essential. And, I would say that in all the work that we're trying to do around financial inclusion, financial education, financial resilience, it's always understanding the barriers first and understanding them directly from people. And we see time and time again that a school can often itself create financial harm for parents. There's a fantastic project in the northeast of London, Poverty Proofing the School Day, and Toynbee Hall was commissioned by Tower Hamlets Council to work with a range of schools across Tower Hamlets to look at how schools themselves create extra costs for parents. And the number of times we could see that just in the way that schools communicated with parents over something actually placed a financial strain on the parents instead of creating a financial solution and encouraging an environment in which parents, children and school could have a conversation. So thinking about this in a holistic way, so not just the children in the school, but also their parents are coming into school. And this is a great opportunity, particularly for parents who are struggling, to be able to have a conversation around how are you doing financially as a family? There's no shame attached here. How can we help? How can we make sure that you're referred to the right support? Are you getting, if you're a pupil premium parent, there'll be other things that you can access. Are you getting access to that? So really thinking holistically in the school environment, not just are we equipping the child for good financial health later in life, but are we actually kind of helping reduce child poverty now?
Just in the defence of academies, I am a governor of an academy, and we're just as likely to do financial education as anybody else. Assembly Member Harani.
Chair. Just thinking about the move towards a more cashless society, we've seen it with local authorities on parking, for example, where many have moved to cashless and using apps and telephone. And you've got the obviously vehicle excise duty for those who drive cars. People have to now buy it online. And some shops during the pandemic were cautious about being that face-to-face contact with customers and businesses as well. Is the declining availability and acceptance of cash adversely impacting certain groups of Londoners, and which groups do you feel are most severely affected? If I can move to Abby first, maybe on that.
I'm clearly going to say older Londoners. I mean, I really would underline for some older Londoners how much they rely on cash. So over half of people over the age of 75 say that using cash is their preferred method. And it's worth flagging up that actually for people of all ages, cash is still the second most common way of making a payment. And then just before the pandemic, there was a survey of older Londoners, and 1 in 5 said that they completely relied on cash and they would really, really struggle without it. So we are enormously concerned by the move that's happened over the pandemic, the rush towards a cashless society, as well as an awful lot of shops and vendors not taking cash anymore. There's been huge closures of both ATMs and bank branches that are making this much, much harder for older people to get by. Or in some areas, we've seen that some ATMs still exist, but they're more likely to be ATMs that charge for use. So there's much more of a barrier there. The Treasury carried out an inquiry and announced plans to protect access to cash. I think it was back in 2020. So they were talking about making cash back possible without purchase and placing a regulator in charge of overseeing the cash system. That's encouraging. We haven't seen anything practical happen yet. I'd also flag up that it's not enough of a solution just to enable cash back without a purchase. There's going to be a real sort of emotional barrier for a lot of people to go into a shop and just ask for the money rather than being able to independently withdraw it, ideally without charge from an ATM.
Sure.
I'm on the Access to Cash Action Group run by UK Finance and chaired by Natalie Seeney, who chaired the Access to Cash Review panel, which I was also on. And so obviously I can't say anything about what's going on in those discussions right now, and I wish I could, because there's lots of good things to come. So my first thing would be to say is please look out for those announcements when they come, and please scrutinise them, and please support the ones that you feel would be helpful. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that the groups that we are seeing who've I guess, really been affected. So people who are disabled and are going to struggle to get to that place where you can access cash were struggling before the pandemic, but there's no doubt that they're going to struggle even more now. If you're using a mobility scooter and it's a nice day and you've got to travel a kilometre on your mobility scooter to get access to cash, and the sun's out and it feels like a really safe world, great. Now turn it into midwinter, it's snowing, you've now got to go, or at least raining in London, it's the same kilometre journey, and maybe the world doesn't feel quite so safe right now, because it's going to be much harder for you to have clear visibility and withdraw cash. So being able to access cash if you have a disability is a really important thing. And the reason it's important is often because when you're struggling with some kind of impairment, whether that's visual, whether that's your hearing, whether it's dexterity, whether it's mobility, kind of having real control is important, but you're significantly more likely to be on benefits. And you're significantly more likely to, in some way, experience other health conditions or a very low income or poor living standards. So disability in London is an indicator for living on a low income. And living on a low income is an indicator for probably needing to budget in cash because it's really hard. So it's a knock-on effect. The other kind of group that I'd really want to draw our attention to are parents with young children. Because, again, if you think about what it's like to live in London, and let's say your branch is closed, there's nothing locally, and you need to go and get access to cash, and you've got to maybe take 2 bus journeys, and you've got 2 children with you on a bus. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly if you then get to that place and that ATM has been shut, and you didn't realise. Or overnight, as been happening, it's been changed to fee charging, and now as well as your bus journey, you've also got to pay £1.85 or £2.50. You don't know, it's going to be out of your control. There's no choice there. So I think we absolutely see that parents of particularly young children, or parents of children with disability, or other needs that mean that you really can't leave them alone, you've really got to have them with you. And then into that kind of group I'd also add carers. So people who are caring for a family member, and it's really hard to leave them alone and they haven't got support. All of those people most likely to be really struggling on a low income, most likely to be trying to budget in cash because it's the single most certain way to avoid unintended debt, most likely to really struggle if we take away free access to cash for them.
And thinking in particular about transport for London as well, and maybe turning to Abby for this question, TfL have also been moving towards a more cashless system of transactions, but thinking about the groups that are affected by it that we've mentioned, older people or disabled people, how important is it that we continue to keep the Freedom Pass and over 60s travel free in London?
Both those things are hugely important. So really the Mayor needs to ensure that commitment to reinstate cash being accepted in all TfL stations, that's vitally important. It's particularly important at the moment because before 9 a.m. you can't use a Freedom Pass, you can't use a 60 plus Oyster card. I mean, we think that temporary suspension should have been lifted quite a long time ago, but it's there at the moment. So that is putting a group of people who are far more likely to be reliant on cash in a position where they will need to do it, to use it if they need to travel before 9 a.m. in the morning. But beyond that, given the reliance on cash amongst older people and other groups, it absolutely needs to be accepted at all stations. It's really important.
To Sian, the 2019 Access to Cash review found that 17% of the population would struggle to cope with a completely cashless society. What action should the Mayor and central government take, both to ensure that cash payments remain widely accepted, but also to equip more people to take digital payments?
So our view at Toynbee Hall is that we do want more people to be able to use digital payments, not least because that's how you best reduce the poverty premium. But until digital payments and digital banking works well for everyone, we need to ensure continued access to cash that doesn't incur additional costs for the individual. And in terms of how we go about that, so there is already a banking agreement where everyone should have access to a free-to-use ATM within at least 1 kilometre of where they live. Now, for some people, where they live isn't necessarily where they need to use cash. And so one of the things that we're encouraging Link Scheme to look at is, and we're working with them on this, is it where you live that you need access to cash, or is it where you need to usually spend cash that you need access to cash? So that's one thing to kind of think about, is when do people need to use cash and why do they need to use it? And then again, drive from that place of understanding, because if we just arbitrarily decide what people need without really exploring what their true needs are today, I think that's really important. What the central government can and should be doing is acting on the pledge to enact legislation. The Action on Cash group that I'm part of is helping craft some of the thinking behind what might go in that legislation. And so my strong hope is that when we make recommendations, they will both take them on board and quickly enact them so that we can hold financial services providers to account. But I think there's a really important point here which I haven't talked about, but is often one of the problems that we see, which is around the idea of competition always being the way to achieve the best outcomes. And very often collaboration is the right way to achieve best outcomes, particularly in the part of the market that is uneconomic to serve at competitive prices. And so one of the things that we both want central government to think about, and also, whether it's the Mayor of London or other cities, is to really think about what's the collaborative space that you can create where financial services firms and the regulator can look at that together and say, well, here's an area of deprivation, or here's an area of extreme need, and we really need to be able to have a conversation about this, and we need to be able to bring all of our data together. We need to be able to talk about creating a service that maybe multiple firms contribute to, for example, and then be able to actually make that happen. So one of the pieces of work that we're doing in the Action on Cash group is really thinking about what does that look like? What's stopping financial services firms working together when individually it's uneconomic to serve a community, but collaboratively they could? And you'll probably have seen a lot of the work that's being done in the community access to cash pilots. And I think looking at the community access to cash pilots work and the evaluation coming out of that, and really thinking about how can we apply that to London. And in particular, it's housing estates. It's making sure that we see a housing estate as a community, and thinking too about how can we work with local authorities to make sure that a suitable place for whether it's an ATM or a community banking hub can be found. And almost certainly there's business rates involved in that, in being able to think about how do we reduce the costs to be able to serve deprived communities. So in terms of ensuring access to cash, it's about making sure that firms don't have to compete with each other unnecessarily, because that just actually drives down service. Creating the spaces and then thinking about how local authorities and London centrally can think about what tools do you have to be able to reduce the cost to bring access to cash in affordable ways. The final piece is around, as you said, access to digital. A piece of work that we did several years ago working with Good Things Foundation, we tested the idea that in our own financial education work, which is, as I say, transformational and has fantastic results, one thing we just couldn't shift was people's willingness to actually transact online. After going through our work and going through our course, they would look up information, they would compare prices, they would do all their research, but at the moment of wanting to buy something, they would come offline and they would go in person to a shop and buy. And we just couldn't work out why. So because this is the way we think, we sat down with people and talked about what's stopping you. And Abby's talked about it really well. It's a kind of double jeopardy of when you go online to buy something, there's two things happening. It's internet and data, and people hear all the time about being scammed, about your data being scammed, about your laptop or your phone being taken over by a virus. Think about how often you hear people saying, oh, my email's been hacked, my Facebook account has been hacked. So the feeling that you're not safe online, particularly if you don't have much experience of being online, is really, really strong for many, many people. So then you can add into that I'm also now going to, in some way, open up a channel between my account and someone else who I can't see because this is online. How do I know they're real? How do I know they're not a scammer? And also, people don't necessarily understand about how bank accounts get emptied, and that it isn't by making a single payment. It's about giving access to your bank account. So people put these two things together and say, I'm not going to buy that thing online from a company that I don't know, that I can't see the person, and I haven't got a receipt in my hand, and that I can't take the item away with me straight away. And I'm certainly not going to do it online where I also risk having my account hacked. So I'm going to move offline. So we ran a pilot working with a whole, large-scale sample of people where instead of doing we'll talk to you about transacting online, we'll actually help you make your first transaction. We'll show you exactly how to do it with your money. Here comes the moment of jeopardy, and we'll help you through it. The numbers were amazing. In the control group, where we just did it as normal, this is how you would do it, no one went to transact online at all. In the pilot group, where we were actually helping people to do it, they all went on to transact online in other ways, reducing their costs, and were all reporting positive benefits. So, my kind of key takeaway from this is data is important, devices are important, but support by your side to start doing these things first time. Abby's talked about it really well for the older community, but it's true for anyone who's not confidently doing this already. So, what can City Hall do? I would suggest a programme across particularly schools and community centres, places where people are already confident and trusted, which is around, if you're not already a confident digital user, and you're not already being able to, for example, pay online, but you'd like to learn how, this is how we're going to help you. And it's actual people who are trained and supported to deliver that work, sitting with someone and helping them make it. That is the thing that will get people over that big barrier. It's the only thing we found that works. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
That's really, really helpful and thorough, thank you.
Just to come in, do you find that, I ask both of you, that's generational? Because I'm a youth worker, I deal with lots of young people, and I'm in the complete reverse. I'm always telling them, don't just click. The way they order things is very easy to them. Is that a generational thing? Do we think that will just shift over time?
In terms of older people, because my focus is just on that and not comparative, I couldn't say with any sort of authority. I think we can see amongst younger older people there is a greater degree of confidence in using the internet, and those people will become older people over time. Although, as I mentioned in response to Caroline's question earlier on, there are some people who stop using the internet and doing transactions online later in their life. We don't know for certain, but assuming some of those things are relating to physical frailty that makes using something like an iPad much more difficult. I don't know if Sian's got anything else to add on.
I'm not surprised to hear you say it, because if you think about how the brain develops, our risk kind of function in the brain isn't fully developed until we're 25. I don't have data for it, but I'm going to go away and have a look.
Because I worry how you hear stories of young people's accounts being used for laundering, etc., because they've been too giving online. Ms. Bakari?
Just very quickly, I'm really pleased that TfL have decided that their decision to suspend cash payments during the pandemic has been reversed. They've decided to carry on, but there's research by TfL that said that 55% of Londoners need cash at tube stations, 67% of children need cash. Do you think we need to continue that pressure on the Mayor and TfL to keep that option to pay with cash at tube stations?
Absolutely. Vulnerable people have to be able to travel to hospital, to school, to family members, and to buy food at affordable prices. People who live in a food desert need to be able to travel. If we are stopping them from travelling because they don't have digital ways of paying, then we are causing many, many greater problems than them just having to walk a short distance. So yes, we absolutely need to keep it.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Garrett?
Been covered,
Thank you. Just a quick thing on tips. Does a cashless society risk people's income? Because I spoke to someone who used to work as a waiter, and he said the only way you could really keep your tips as if they were handed to you. If they were put in a big pot, mysterious things happened. So if we as a culture eschew cash, does that risk some people's income?
Yes, but I would say that there are better ways to deal with that than protecting cash. And that's around employment rights and clarity over how, for example, tips are used. And we've already got legislation in place around that. We've already got good media coverage around that. That doesn't mean that it's not important to carry on with it. But in and of itself, I don't think that that's a reason to keep cash. I think it's a reason to really reinforce employment rights and rights to a living.
Agenda, as well as the Mayor's agenda, to warrant a visit to us. That would have been very useful. But that brings us today to the end of our session. Let me just say thank you to our guests. As I've said before, you have been a real education. It's been really useful to hear your evidence, and the outputs from this committee will reflect much of the evidence you've given today. If there's anything you think we've missed, please do let us know in all the ways that you can, email, letters, etc., etc. I can now release you to the wild while we just quickly go for our formal business. Thank you very much again for your attendance. Really much appreciated. Can the committee note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion? Can we ask the committee to note the work programme and additional activities, namely the roundtable meeting on the nighttime economy and the site visit to the Tower of London and Tower Bridge?
Noted.
The date of the next meeting of the Economy Committee is scheduled to be the 10th of December 2021 at 10 a.m. It doesn't give a venue, but I'm going to hazard a guess it might be in... Oh no, it definitely won't be in this chamber. Oh, it definitely won't be in this chamber. So let's see where we are meeting. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.